day 2 of the event. This is energy storage for social equity. As you just probably saw, we are recording this event, and we did yesterday so that we have copies of what everyone contributed. And we do expect to summarize all of these thoughts into a report and offer some of this material again for everyone's review. So if you didn't catch it the first time, we'll make it possible for you to see it again. This is the second day of the event. The first day yesterday, we featured the Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, welcoming everyone and talking about the importance of this idea. We had a presentation from Professor Vivek Chandas discussing kind of the context for the situation and how between redlining, historic practices and climate, we see a lot of pressures beyond energy for these communities that are relevant for us to think about as we try to work on energy equity issues. And then we had panels featuring states and community voices to talk about what this issue means to them. We are so pleased to have a day 2 that's more of turning towards this idea of what's the nexus between energy storage and social equity issues. What is it about this technology that might lend itself to solving some of our social challenges? I am encouraging you guys to, if you have any comments for us as we're going through or any questions, attendees, please use the chat function. This is going to be your tool to communicate with us, and we'll do our best to respond to you or respond to any questions you have within the context of these panels. Our event today, the agenda is provided on the website that's provided on this welcome page. We do have, in addition, several readers to help orient you to this context and this topic, as well as all of the bios for our speakers and our panelists. So please take a look at the website. Let us know if you have any questions. The readers discuss business models like community energy storage, decommissioning, or otherwise addressing peakers. We talk about metrics for system scale, for program scale investments for the grid. And we also speak more generally to what we think the connections might be between energy storage and energy equity. So I want to hand this over now to my colleague Stan Atsidi at Sandia National Laboratories. Stan, if you're with us, if you can please join the chat and offer your introductory remarks.
I don't see Stan on at the moment. I did just resend a link to him, a minute ago, so hopefully he'll be on very soon.
Okay. Imra, maybe you and I can just talk for a moment about the rest of the day today while Stan joins us. This is a classic challenge of being online. So my name is Rebecca O'Neill. I never quite said that. I work at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and this event is conducted with Sandia National Laboratories in support of the Office of Electricity at the US Department of Energy. And we're fortunate to have the Director of Energy Storage Research, Imra Juk, here also to offer his welcome. So Imra, would you mind speaking for a moment?
Yes, of course. It's a great pleasure to see this roundtable, which we have prepared for several months now, and to see it come to fruition. And it's doing everything it is supposed to do. It brings people together. It illuminates the subject from different perspectives. Yesterday, we heard from the states and how they are involved, and we heard from communities and what their needs are, and how they express themselves in terms of the equity issues. And of course, these issues are not new, but the perspective from the point of view of energy justice is somewhat new. And it's really only now that we are looking at this more seriously, and we're bringing together various approaches that we have already started. And one of those are tribal projects. And that's why we are very pleased to have Wahela Jones with us, Wahela Jones with us today, who is going to offer a few remarks. And hopefully my friend Stan Atzity will show up, who is my program manager for power electronics and who has gotten us a great number of awards. And this will lead over into a project by Professor Deepak Divan, who is working on a project for the Navajo reservation. And that will carry over into our two panels, which we will have in the afternoon. So looking forward to exciting things. And well, we'll see how it pans out.
Thank you, Imra. I believe we have Stan joining us now. And the reason is you'll see shortly is that we're very pleased to have Stan do the introduction because it's a special form of introduction. So this is why it's not just the same as me reading out the bio that's provided online. So Stan, are you available now to take over the helm? Yes, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning again, everyone. I have a distinct pleasure of introducing our next speaker, and she's the Senior Advisor and Director of the DOE Office of Indian Energy and Policy and Programs. Ms. Wahela Johns is our speaker, and just want to introduce myself to Wahela. Yat e hapena, yat e huene khainia, she not ani nezne isina sha, shupra yen funde. Yat e oni khainia do yo kwadi nothing that no which I had saying that no e bedane klon khainia for kehela. Ado khahda she hajo che haditse to kehotizin so adine jono yat oni haditse. So thank you, Wahela. It's good to see you, and we're looking forward to your presentation. We're excited that you're here, and just getting your perspective on this topic of equity and all that from your office. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Atzity, for all of your work. I've been reading about the history of the Office of Indian Energy, and yeah, your name comes up a lot and just the current work that you do. So I appreciate your remarks and making that connection. Yat everyone, and to Mr. Atzity, Yat means hello, good greetings, or many things too. It represents that just Yat and I'm Salt Clan Ashihin Nishle do Bashichin. And I'm from northeastern Arizona on the Navajo Nation in the area called Twinjone. And currently I'm in Arizona and it is beautiful weather here in Flagstaff. And I'm actually on my way to DC, moving my family there next week. So it's a really fun time to be in the Southwest and also get to hopefully get rain. We've been in somewhat of a drought up here, and we've been also just recognizing that there's high temperatures everywhere and throughout, our country. And I think for me, I wanted to thank you all for organizing this important topic around equity and energy storage, and also power and energy in Indian country. Our office has been, was stood up about 10 years ago. And we've had a number of great leaders within directors within the Office of Indian Energy. And through the Energy Policy Act of 2005, our office is charged by Congress to promote Indian energy development, efficiency and use, reduce and stabilize energy costs, and enhance and strengthen Indian tribal energy and economic infrastructure. And also around electrification and bringing electrical power and service to Indian land and homes. And with this, we are a somewhat small office. We have been, at one point, we were down to 2 to 4 people, and now we are growing to 12. And we're going to keep growing because we are organizing this office to really expand our work into currently what we do is offer financial assistance to projects, shovel-ready projects throughout Indian country. And then also technical assistance to tribes at no cost to assist in where they're at in their kind of project planning in regards to energy. And we've invested over 180 million or more into Indian country, and that's about 180 energy projects throughout Indian country. So each of those projects have had great benefits with cost savings and also just building capacity, because tribes, this shovel-ready projects allowed tribes to understand how energy works in their tribal nation, and so it's building that capacity. The other area that we are focused on is energy education and capacity building, and so these are kind of the core areas that we feel like is always needed in Indian country. And our office, we have 3 areas that we're based in, and one in Anchorage. We have an office in Anchorage, Alaska, and then Golden, Colorado, and in Washington, D.C. So I've been in this role for about 5 months, and it's been really amazing, exciting, and I'm just really proud of all the staff and the people who have built the Office of Indian Energy. And I'm excited about the future. We are hoping to get, since I've been in this role, to get more funding so that we can support more projects, and then we can also look towards some of the kind of issues that have been within our communities that have not been addressed, like energy access. In Indian country, we have thousands of homes that don't have access to power today. And my previous role or employment prior to this role was with Native Renewables, which is a nonprofit organization that was focused on addressing energy access in the Southwest, and created off-grid solar plus battery storage, and a whole approach that was very holistic around the need to educate homeowners on, if what off-grid solar is like, and how to manage their energy load, and also just the basics of energy education, but creating kind of the translation that is needed in Diné or in Hopi. And I think that Diné meaning Navajo, or in Hopi. And so understanding the cultural kind of connection that is really, I think, key in all of this work that we're doing around energy today. So if you're talking about energy storage, renewable energy, all of these, some of this technology is fairly new to someone that lives in maybe a remote area of Indian country. And I think our role within the federal agency and our role in the kind of energy sector, for it to be equitable, we have to kind of lay a foundation of really connecting with our constituents and being able to translate, these concepts of technology and how it works to consumers and to customers, because that right there is how we're going to be able to, as a society, understand our energy load within our household or our community or within a tribal building, because you design a project or anything based on your load. But also if you live in a remote place and you only have batteries and solar systems, then you really have to be careful too, because there's limitations to that. And I think this is the part that I feel like the education is so critical from homeowners that want to use off-grid solar and battery storage. But at a larger scale, a community and commercial scale, I think those are the similar concepts of the teaching and the learning that goes in with building capacity internally within tribal communities and giving them the leadership and the tools to be able to grow that that base of knowledge. And that leads to many more projects. And that leads to job creation. And that leads to, this equity, that we're talking about, because, how historically energy has been done in Indian country has been, mostly from outside, interests and corporations and communities. And so, or nation or companies. So it's, that has to shift and we have to figure out how to adjust the way that the model of energy development is done today in this country, because that's the only way we're going to get to this equity and energy justice piece. And so I just want to speak to that specifically because I know all of you are, at some capacity are wanting to, do more projects and make it more available to community. And this connection piece is really critical to relating to our constituents. And so that's been one value that the Office of Energy, Indian Energy has, is that making sure that, we are also being very culturally sensitive to our constituents and understanding our trust responsibility to every tribal nation and the unique location as well for Native communities. And so there's a lot to learn, and I'm learning every day, and I'm really excited about continuing to build and partner with all of you as well. So our office is, been encouraging others to just, reach out to us and also build those partnerships because we can't do it alone. And some of the kind of upcoming initiatives are going to be focused on energy access and rural electrification, but also around this workforce development piece and creating a pathway for students, tribal students that are at tribal colleges and universities that can, learn how renewable energy works, how it can be implemented within our nations, and also be the clean energy leaders. And that's pretty much my goal as a director and for this office is we want tribal nations to lead the way towards this 100% clean energy movement. And we also want to take part and make sure that we're part of this kind of growing economy. And so that's the vision that, I've been, bringing to this space. And I'm excited about this administration because, they are really focused on addressing the climate crisis and energy access and energy justice. And also making sure that the way that we work is equitable for communities that haven't been at the table and communities that have been left behind or in the shadows of pollution of industries. So just wanted to say that, and thank you so much for allowing me to speak for a few minutes.
Yeah, when you handsy, shade us and snido is a fun bush chain to the chain that it shakes. So he doesn't know it. Shade us in it or here nature handsy. I don't think, yeah.
Thank you.
Rebecca?
Well, thank you very much. And Yate. And I would like to particularly respond to the importance of cultural sensitivity. Stan and I have been doing a small tribal initiative in which we have been working with native entities from the northern shores of Alaska to the Navajos to the Seminoles over the whole country. But of course, it's much smaller than anything you're doing. But one of the things that we are really trying to work on is the idea of energy sovereignty for the areas. The initiative has to pass on to the native entities, and the benefits have to go to them, and not just the benefits, but the financial benefits and the control as well. So just as there should be autonomy of decisions, there should be energy sovereignty as well. So
yes, I totally agree, 100%. And yeah, I appreciate that. And that's the goal, is to inspire tribal communities and leaders to learn and build their capacity, so that we can, it's not just a few people that are doing energy, renewables or clean energy. It's like everyone has an understanding and can, and it's not just also like a few people that have that expertise, that we are, creating a pathway where we do have, engineers that are native and that are within the community that are guiding also, and then also the community leaders that are helping guiding the process. Because I think that's the part of the sovereignty piece, is every nation is unique with different types of leaders, but also the needs are different. And so I think what we've been providing is resources. And so, in this role, I hope to provide many more resources and leverage also interagency cooperation, so that we can really support Indian country to grow their or develop their energy vision.
Well, we will be happy to collaborate informally or formally with the Indian Energy Office, and we look forward to a long association.
And I believe Stan is my father by clan.
We just determined that right now.
Well, he's my friend, so
that's the beauty of the clan. You meet relatives throughout the reservation. We have a large reservation, and you get to meet uncles and aunts and fathers and whatever when you do that. That's the beauty of the clan system. So it just happened right now. That's
excellent.
At this point, Imra, we had talked about a few minutes, just talking about the program that you and Stan cooperate on, the very thing that Wahela was just describing. Maybe you could talk about the role in the program, and then we have a few more minutes before we move on to Deepak's presentation.
Yeah, the thing is, we are actually learning as well as teaching, because every one of the tribes we work with has different objectives. So, for example, with the Navajos, it's remoteness that we work on. With Picuris Pueblo, it's high rates that they're being charged by neighboring utilities. With the San Carlos Apaches, it's outages. They have more than 100 outages a year. Storage is an obvious solution. With the Seminoles, it's grid instability. Their voltage keeps varying, particularly with the weather. And with Levelock, it's almost all of the above. It's remoteness, certainly. And it's also high rates because they're using diesel as their main fuel. And we are hoping to introduce them to a certain amount of renewables, and to use the storage to dispatch the diesel in a way that uses less fossil fuel materials. So every one of those is a new challenge and a new excitement, and of course a new culture again, because, well, obviously tribes are not just Indians, they are individual tribes with individual characteristics. And so I find it personally satisfying to learn more about the culture and to see how we can interact in the best possible way. Stan?
Yeah, just going through the tribes, the tribal sovereignty, just like it was mentioned earlier with Walea. It's the sovereignty is key, and having the tribes themselves know what they need. That's by definition sovereignty, is that the community themselves are the ones that understand what they need. So if you have an energy mix, one of the pleasures I've had working with the tribes is providing basically unbiased information to the tribe to let them know that, educate them and see what kind of solutions that are available to them. And they themselves make these decisions. We hand that off and they have an informed decision on these projects. So multiple projects that we have under storage programs with Dr. Jouk's program, spanning from advanced power electronics to systems level technical and economic analysis type tribes. So 5 tribes and 6 projects is currently under the portfolio, and one of which is the next speaker, which is Georgia Tech. So anything else, Dr. Jouk?
No, I think we are going to go on now to Deepak Divan, whom I have the pleasure to introduce. And he's a professor at Georgia Tech. And Deepak and I go way back to early days when I was able to fund his work on smart wires, which is now a $1 billion business. Nowadays, he runs a group which works on giving people all around the world access to electricity. So same thing we are trying to do here in the US, he is doing worldwide. And today he will give us a presentation on a project to provide smart power to remote locations on the Navajo reservation. And I think Stan can add something to that on the design criteria for this project.
Yes, one of the things that's I found very unique to this project is that, and I don't think I've run across this before, is to have a tribal entity be an integral part of the design process. And so Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, along with Georgia Tech and Sandia, working on formulating the specifications for what's needed on a reservation is very unique. It's a very unique project in that way. It is typically an outside firm or a consultant or something like that providing information. But here's an opportunity where the Navajo tribe will get exactly what they need for some of the remote power system. And that's what Dr. Divan is working on. So that's the very uniqueness part of this project.
Deepak, you're on.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to try and see if that share screen approach works still. Okay. All right. I'm presuming that works. And thank you very much, Imre. Well, a very inspiring presentation. Thank you very much. And Stan, always a pleasure to hear from you. So I have to say I'm honored, to have been chosen to talk about the project. Thank you very much for thinking about me. I certainly enjoyed yesterday's presentation that Vivek Shandas had given. They're very different aspects of energy equity, but hopefully we can tie it all together through this roundtable. we are at a very major transformational point, I think, in our history, where renewable energy and storage, prices are rapidly reducing and are coming down, to grid parity in almost all locations. The question is that will the people who live in remote communities miss the energy equity equation again? I think that becomes the major concern. I mean, the other concern, of course, is resilience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Just 1 second on Georgia Tech and the Center for Distributed Energy. I think Imre mentioned we do a lot of work in the grid-related area, energy access area, and then taking technology and transferring that to to market. We've done that many times, and smart wires was one of the examples that we've given. But happy to talk about that at some other point in time. Here I want to focus today on the whole question of energy equity and resiliency. Most of us who live on the continental U.S. take power for granted, but as Viola mentioned, there's thousands of people who live off grid even today, and many communities suffer from very poor quality and reliable power. And that definitely includes the Native American nations, right? The other piece that we are beginning to grapple with more and more as climate-related, kind of changes, things like hurricanes, wildfires. We've seen those in California. Those things are really, can drive extended outages, whether it's Puerto Rico, whether it's Texas, whether it's Florida. And then you have things like equipment failure or, extended cascading outages that can still result in, extended outages on bulk power systems. And the impact on poorer communities is much, much more than everybody else who can afford to put a backup generator and survive for a certain amount of time. So there's this need for some kind of a cost-effective, equitable solution to provide power to these communities, to be able to maintain life. So, the question is, what can be done? I mean, there's examples here of Navajo homes, as well as the high impact, low frequency events that we talked about. So what are the available options that we have out here? I mean, if you can afford it, you put a backup generator on your house, you can have a microgrid on a critical facility, and people are doing that. The problem is that you do need to have skilled technicians to install and operate these things. If you're in a small community or remote community, that's a much, very challenging and very, very expensive. You can put a small solar home system on your system and on your house, and that's starting to that's a big play on energy storage. Typical home would need somewhere between 1 kilowatt to 10 kilowatts. And what would that homeowner like? They of course want to sustain their critical loads, whether it's lighting, phones, televisions, internet connectivity. And then, they may have some high power loads that they want to run once in a while. They may have power tools they want to run once in a while. Most people would like to, not spend a huge amount if they can't afford it, or if they don't have a need. Start small, build as you need it. And then you need to have flexibility to manage your daily requirements. And what we see right now is that the existing state-of-the-art solutions tend to be, fairly expensive. I think there's I call it a failure of imagination when you're in California in the middle of fire season, and you have an electric vehicle in your garage and solar panels on your roof, and you're sitting in the dark for a week. That really should not happen. There's a failure of technology to be able to deliver something that's reasonable out there. But in any case, even if you did want to put your make your house, have a power wall or something and back things up, that could be a $20,000-$25,000 expenditure before you do that. So that's, again, not a very common solution. So when Stan and were talking and said, okay, what can we do here to kind of come up with a solution that is more suited to remote communities, to energy resiliency, to things that, where you cannot have the electrician come and spend hours to put this thing together. So we said we need a safe, flexible, reliable, efficient, a plug-and-play building block type of a system that you can kind of stack together to address a range of applications. And then to Stan's point out here, the process we normally follow on this is really what I call a storyboarding, kind of a session where we sit down with the intended users and really try to understand in as much gory detail as possible how they would be, kind of looking to use, these solutions that we're developing. And in this particular case, it's, we're talking about energy constrained communities such as the Navajo Nation, and seeing, what is it that would be really a sweet spot for them, and what are they not getting currently from existing solutions that are in the market. So, the first, so this is a kind of a laundry list of all the things that together we came up with, and the involvement, for Derek Terry was, through the process out here. So plug and play, we just talked about that. Quick installation, minimum downtime. If you want to do it yourself, you don't want 350 volts DC running around, where people can get, kind of harmed. And so one way to do that is to keep everything at touch safe levels so that people can do it themselves. Install the PV panels, install batteries if needed. You'll see it's even more integrated than that. The other thing is, most people don't really care about sources. They have the grid sometimes, they have solar sometimes, they have batteries sometimes, and they're all sources of energy. And you should not have to have a PhD in electrical engineering to figure out which one can be connected to what. So there needs to be a very simple way of, putting all these things into one, and it has to figure it out for itself, right? Should be flexible. You can, sometimes you want to run individual loads. Sometimes you want to stack them and run a home. Sometimes you take it to a community center and you want to run, a set of, loads for, managing a function. Sometimes you want to stack these together and connect them together to form a microgrid. Okay, today that's a major exercise to form a microgrid. Can we do it in a plug and play manner? This was a very good challenge that was posed to us. I think that sounds really interesting. It should, it should sometimes be connected to the grid, sometimes act as a microgrid, sometimes in grid forming mode, sometimes in grid following mode. And these are challenges that the power electronics community is still kind of trying to work their way through. But ideally, this is what we would like to see. And then to make the value work, I mean, if you can export power to the utility, you might be able to pay for this much more easily. And then, of course, you want to be able to monitor it and everything else, bake in the safety and the cybersecurity. So yeah, this is really what I've called PhD in the box. I mean, you put the smarts inside the box, so this becomes very easy to use. This is what we are doing. I'll have a couple of slides that are going to be tech dense, so my apologies for that. For those who are interested, this is a topology that we've been working with. We call it the soft switching solid state converter, a solid state transformer. This is a multi-port system. It can take an internal battery, an external PV, and connect it to the grid or the microgrid in pretty much any way you want. It's a very efficient converter. And the form factor we are looking at is really this cube that we've been talking about. You can take this and connect them in parallel or connect to the grid, or pretty much do whatever you want. So if somebody's got questions, I'm happy to talk to that, or you can reach out to me directly and I'll be happy to answer questions on that. The idea is that, again, you are able to take these and run appliances off it when you want. You can take them, stack them together. You can actually connect it to the grid, to the house electrical system. For that, you would need an electrician. You could have a battery on the outside if you wanted to add more storage, you could actually do that. Or you could take one of these devices and take it and put it in your pickup truck and drive around and be able to run your tools and things like that on it. So the flexibility is all there. The target price here was under $1,000 for the PV panel, the battery, the converter all together. And so if you can return that energy back to the grid, you might be able to get a less than a 3-year payback on it just from grid energy sales alone. And that starts looking very interesting, overall. So the question is, how do you get this level of autonomous flexible control? I mean, you know, 20, 30 years back, it wasn't possible. Technology wasn't there at a point where it would give you all the capability that you wanted. Today, we actually, I think the tables are turned. If you can describe exactly what you want, there's a possibility that we can do it at reasonable cost. So here's the challenge that I'm going to pose to everybody, right? I mean, we spent all our time designing devices to do one control function, control the output. We're now getting to the point where the grid is now going to work as an ecosystem. We're going to have, you know, now tens of distributed energy devices and eventually millions of distributed energy devices all connected together. And the question is, how do you manage this grid? When that is also the generation and it's also the load. You know, we've been talking about this idea of collaborative control, where you have standard rules and local measurements on which these devices actually operate. And they operate so as to be able to manage their own load, but also to sustain the grid ecosystem at the same time. The system is constantly changing, so you don't really, you know, have that information available to you. You also have to worry about, you know, cybersecurity and the latency of communications. So if you kind of overall look at this, this is a very different paradigm. And you say that this cannot be done, right? Well, look at how we drive on the road. If you look at that, you know, you could have a 1921 Ford Model T and a 2021 Tesla Model S all driving together on the street without communication, without anything else. And you have intelligent agents that are actually making these decisions. It's the same thing that is happening here. You know, when you ride a tandem bike with your wife, you're not talking to each other, but you're regulating how much power is being you know, submitted by whom. And we've actually done this at my last company, Verintech, where we actually were able to build grid controlling systems using completely distributed autonomous controls. And we have a project with ARPA-E right now to build autonomous inverters that work with minimal system knowledge and can actually coordinate with each other. So we're bringing all these technologies to bear in the AC Cube, actually. Okay, so here's some early validation. Again, forgive the tech dense material here, but this is just to show that this technology is beginning to work. And on the right, you see some examples of what happens when you actually take these devices and slam them together and you know, actually form a microgrid and be able to work. So yes, there's some technical depth behind how these things are actually operating. We are now in the process of beginning to you know, complete the build on these. You know, and a single AC Cube is going to run with 4 PV, you know, with a 250 watt PV panel, and you can take 4 of the AC Cubes and stack them together to get 5 kilowatts. You can multiply that by 2 to get 10 kilowatts. You can have an external 48 volt battery if you know, if you would like, and then you can connect these in parallel, you know, at multiple locations. So here, you know, left above is a standalone single AC Cube. Left below is standalone stacked AC Cubes. On the right below is a microgrid system with multiple devices and multiple homes that you can interconnect, simply interconnect, and they start operating. And then the third on top is really, you know, you could hopefully, you know, have in a resiliency situation, get these quickly to site and just connect, plug and play, connect them and be operational. So there's a significant amount of need for something like this. So, you know, starting to kind of look at where we are here, you know, so we have very good alignment with, you know, the needs that have been defined by the Navajo Nation. We work very closely with them. They have helped us to drive the specification on these devices in terms of what the use cases are, you know, how they're going to be installed, how they're going to be, you know, deployed, you know, what are the conditions under which the community will use them, individuals will use them, and, you know, and I think what we've come up with is a solution which seems to be uniquely suited for their requirements, at least out here. And I think I would extend that to say that, you know, because we've kind of taken it down to this level, you know, there's a number of different audiences that could use this capability. And if this comes without a significant cost, you know, burden, then, you know, why not, right? I mean, this is very different from what is, you know, typically available today. So here are the examples of what you can actually do with it. You have an intrinsic safety here so that you can get this installed by untrained members, which for remote communities is, and for resilient communities is very important. It's plug and play, you know, where you can work, you can have this in work environments as well as community environments as well. You can stack the modules to scale the power, and you can build the system gradually so you don't have to invest in everything all at the same time. Low cost for hardware installations. This whole idea of collaborative control is very new. In the fact that these things work in grid forming mode or microgrid modes really makes this very, very flexible in terms of how you put these together. We see this scaling up to high power levels as well, working on multiple projects right now to be able to build larger grids and microgrids with this as well. And then high efficiency, high reliability, And finally, I think, as you start looking at deploying these very smart, intelligent assets that have to work with each other and work with the grid, and you have thousands of them eventually, and even more, there has to be a backbone that is a communications monitoring and a coordination backbone that is critical for these devices to all operate. Today, that even if you reduce the cost of the power conversion down to zero, the cost of that coordinated communications and coordination backbone can be quite high. And so that's one of the things that we think is really important. We've been working on a solution, again, with DOE resources. Thank you very much, DOE. On a system for building edge sensors and edge control devices. We call it Gamma for Global Asset Monitoring Management Analytics Platform. These are very low cost, $3-4 kind of kernels that are able to communicate from anywhere in the world, are able to sense and able to store data and able to do edge computing and do it with full cybersecurity embedded into it. That allows us to kind of be able to think about coordinating all these devices and being able to monitor what's happening and to be able to dispatch people to support it if ever needed, right? Finally, I think let me add just one more thing. I think Imre mentioned this when we started off the whole process of energy access. Is obviously a problem in the US, and we need to take care of it. But if you look beyond the US, this is a very, very challenging issue. There's 3 billion who live in extreme energy poverty. 1 billion are pretty much off grid, and only 15 million of them have tier 2 access, which is 200 watt hours a day. That's nothing, So, the only solution we have, the World Bank and others are doing, is roll the grid out, grid extension. If we were successful, there would be another 3.7 gigatons of carbon emissions. That's certainly not okay. Ultimately, what we see is that people don't need energy. They need livelihood and services. So the question is, how does this energy turn into livelihood and services? We are at a point where there's a new paradigm. If you look at Human Development Index, we see that for that to grow, you have to have lots and lots of energy consumed. But now with newer technologies, we may be changing that. We may be able to get to a higher Human Development Index with a lower amount of energy. So we were seeing a very significant problem here in that there were no good solutions that were really working for this most needy part of the population. Grid extension was not working. Many grids were not working. Solar home systems were not giving them everything they needed. So through IEEE Power Electronics Society, we launched a global competition called it IEEE Empower a Billion Lives. The idea was to kind of look at what teams from regions could come up with. So we launched this and had this in 2019. We had 450 teams from 70 countries that participated in it. We gave almost $500,000 in awards to the teams, and we are now getting ready to launch EBL2. Tomorrow actually is a virtual workshop on energy access. And if anybody's interested, please go look at Power Electronics Society or go to empowerabillionlives.org, and you can register for that workshop and join us. So thank you very much, Imre, for allowing us to talk about this. I think it's very much related to what we are doing. It's a bigger extension of that. So to conclude, I think out here, I'm hoping that we have time for Q&A, and I had promised Rebecca I'd try to keep this to about 20 minutes or so. So the vision that I've painted out here, I hope, is that we have a future grid that's coming, whether you want it or not. and it'll either be chaotic, or we could kind of build it the way we need to. At the National Academy's recent report, we kind of talked about this on the future grid. We talked about the fact that, in the future, reliability and resiliency should come from the grid edge. Okay, because ultimately that's where all the people live and all the customers are. Okay, and access to low-cost energy can come from the bulk power system, and it's available. That's kind of marries the best of both worlds. And what we are doing out here is exactly that. We are putting storage at the edge. We are putting resiliency at the edge. We are putting, reliability at the edge. And when the grid works, you still have the access, the availability of low-cost bulk power, but you don't get kind of hamstrung when it's not available, and your life quality doesn't quite go down. So one key element to achieve this goal was this flexible plug-and-play power brick, which we designed specifically for the Navajo Nation, but also really as a community resiliency solution, after HILF events. And this whole idea was that if we could design this right, the PhD would be inside the box, not outside the box, trying to connect it. And that allows us to, really realize this, scheme of plug-and-play type of activity. To be able to do that, we had to really evolve some universal control schemes that are very novel, hopefully we are able to demonstrate that. The objective is next year sometime we'll be in full demonstration of these solutions. So once again, Imre and Stan, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to everybody, and I'd love to open it up for questions. Thanks, Rebecca.
I'm not sure if you can see in the chat, but a lot of people are very enthusiastic about your presentation, very interested in the AC Cube and in learning more.
Let me stop sharing so then I can probably see the chat. I can't see the chat right now.
Sure. But if it, can you offer just, is there a website that people can go to learn more about this? This is something that's still in the research phase. Is that right?
Yeah, this is in, so there are elements of this. So for that S4T, topology is actually now getting ready to go commercial, should be available by the end of the year, I'm hoping. So that's that. But this implementation is not, with the 48-volt DC is not. So this is still kind of research. This, it's really pushing the limits in terms of the technology. So yeah, that part will be, we are hoping to have the first operational unit end of the year as well, and then have multiple units forming the microgrids that we talked about.
Fantastic. And thank you to everybody who's putting questions in the chat. I guess if you don't mind, Deepak, I'll just select a couple to ask you before we move on to the next panel. Sure. One question is about the interoperability standards and communication protocols associated with the AC Cube. Can you offer any thoughts there?
That's a 1 hour discussion by itself. I think, we keep talking about standards, but standards are very challenging in fast moving technology areas. So we're focusing on interoperability. We actually have a proposal with PNNL and NREL to DOE, hopefully we get that, but where we're actually looking at interoperability requirements, especially when you start looking at grid connected inverters. So that's a major problem. What we are trying to do with the controls out here is make it so you're fairly agnostic to it. We're trying to build that intelligence in so that, just like, you get into a car, you don't worry about, is this a Ford or a Volkswagen? You get in and start driving. Why can't we have that level of smarts buried in the inverter so we can actually figure it out and be able to do it? You have to have rules for that. And that's what we're trying to understand is what is that middle layer of rules that allows for interoperability across vendors, across technology generations, because we're going to do a lot of movement between now and the next 10 years. So how the hell do we manage that?
Right. A lot of the comments in the chat are going to this kind of question of how will it, if one investment in one place is good, but I think you pointed this out, that your vision is that it gets installed and can operate in parallel and have some capability in a networked fashion, not just as an individual.
So the fundamental issue with the reason the grid looks the way it does now is because, there really wasn't a way to do proper controls back then, right? 100 years back, there was no controllability that was there. It's a miracle that we actually got the level of control and scale that we did. I think it's one of the biggest engineering achievements of all time. Okay, now we come to the point where we're trying to get the control for millions of these devices all trying to work together. That is a completely different animal, and I think we're beginning to solve the problem there.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I'm trying to weave together some of these questions. One of them is was interesting to me about application spaces. So you pointed out, the Navajo Nation offers one example. Can you offer your thoughts on other ways that the AC Cube might be, or these kinds of applications might be relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, I think it's a good resiliency play. To see, my mother's house in India is better wired than my house here, because power is so bad that they've already pre-wired the house for a light and a fan in each room. Okay, and so all you do is just stick a small UPS on that, and you automatically have lights and fans, right? In my house out here, I have to bring the electrician in and completely rewire the panel, and that's why it's so expensive to put a power wall on it, right? So the question is, how do you get around that? For new build, you should, I think, automatically make the houses so that you have this resiliency piece built into it. But today, when all loads are always connected, okay, this becomes a big problem for black start, for utilities. There's a whole bunch of issues related to that, I think.
I have two more questions for you. And I love the example of your mother's home in India being more prepared in that respect than ours. One question is about climate. Are there any thoughts that you have about cold climate challenges versus or tropical climates and the interactions there? And the other question is about, I think they're thinking about the supply chain for this. And as we're talking about equity, keeping the lights on is one feature of equity, or making sure that there's power supply. But the other is making sure that the supply chain and the commercial vendor opportunity that's being created is sustainable itself, right? So maybe you could just offer your thoughts on those two things, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, supply chain, and the whole question of enterprise is really, really challenging, especially when you start tackling the energy access communities where their ability to spend is already constrained. So one of the things that we find works better is the idea of what we call value stacking. If you can kind of get additional services from the resources that you're not using all the time, which is why I kind of put that thing in of, if you can have solar panels and return power back to the grid, you might be able to pay for that automatically in 2 or 3 years, and it'll be much better to finance that. So that's one element of it. The whole question of supply chain. I mean, are there materials that you're using in the supply chain that are problematic? Yes, I mean, storage is likely to be in that category, especially with lithium. But I'm sure there's no limit on creativity that we have, and we will eventually come up with a way of effectively recycling most of the lithium. And 98% of the lead and lead acid batteries is recycled. Why can't we do that for lithium? It's more expensive, I get it, but it's doable. Or go to cheaper chemistries. I mean, those are also coming along, right? I mean, so there's a whole bunch of different things that'll happen. This thing is in flux right now. I haven't, in the National Academy report, we did not put a forecast on what's going to happen, because every forecast that was given in the last 20 years has been completely wrong. So we didn't want to have one more forecast added to the mix and say this one's wrong too, right? So we said, here are the scenarios that can happen. Here are the fast moving tracks. I mean, we call it a freight train, it's coming fast. How they all evolve is going to depend on economics, is going to depend on policy, it's going to depend on customer adoption, on so many other things. And which one begins to pull ahead could fundamentally change the outcome. So, get your seatbelts on. I think we're in for a ride.
I almost want to just stop there, because that's a great way to end. And I think the person was asking in the context, especially of when you're talking with energy access, and thinking about engineering inside the box, also thinking of the recycling and some of the other issues you just described. But many more hours could be spent on this topic. Thank you to everybody for the chat. All of the slides will be posted after the event. So yes, you will have access to all that information. Uh,
I can try to look at some of the chat comments and see if I can respond to some of them while we are on right now.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. We're going to move now to our next panel.
Thank you.
We have several folks joining, and this is a moment of transition here. We have Bobby Jeffers from Sandia National Laboratories, who will be our moderator for the panel, and I'm going to hand it over to him as soon as we get all these people transferred around. And he will lead us on a panel we're calling Utility Best Practices. So this is starting to, again, inflect from talking about storage solutions. It's to start talking about the grid implications of some of the equity issues that we discussed yesterday at the state scale, at the community scale, and starting to think more about the grid implications of this piece. So I'll hand it over to my colleague, Bobby, and to the panelists, Heather, Tina, Uzma, and Jessica.
Rebecca, can you guys hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Great, great. So we've got, I think, a great panel set up today. And as Rebecca mentioned, this panel is titled Utility Business Practices for Equity. I'm Bobby Jeffers. I will be moderating the panel today. I'm from Sandia National Laboratories, where I do work for the energy storage program as well as other programs, thinking about the convergence of things like resilience, equity, sustainability, and affordability, and have most notably been leading quite a bit of work on the resilience side and more recently on the equity side of that 4 pillars. So I'd like to thank Dr. Zook for this opportunity to have this panel today, and also thanks to the great 4 panelists that we have today, of whom we'll introduce quite shortly. So really what we're talking about, if we can go to the next slide, is that our panel is focused on practical considerations in both planning and then also implementing a more equitable grid. Our panelists today are going to discuss best practices and present some novel approaches to considering equity within grid planning. And we hope to reveal some opportunities for best approaches and also potentially some new utility business models in this session. This welcome's just going to take another few minutes, and we will hear from each of our speakers. I've asked the speakers to try to keep it to 7 minutes each so we can leave a little bit of time for clarifying Q&A for each of the speakers. And then we'll have a session on moderated Q&A led by me and asking questions from the panelists. So our panelists today are Heather Moline from the Northwest Energy Coalition, Tina Jayawira from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, Uzma Siddiqui from Seattle City Light, and Jessica Lynn from OPower. So thanks guys for being here today. And I just have one more slide to kick us off here, which is to think about when we're planning for the grid, think about the performance of the grid and how it impacts equity. And so if we can think about the performance of the power system in 3 different dimensions, things like the efficiency, the resilience, and the sustainability of our grid, each of these have also equity informing metrics that we can use in our planning processes. And so we have some pretty good ones for efficiency and affordability, like energy burden, access to clean energy jobs, things like that. But we're only starting to develop these types of equity informing metrics in the resilience dimension. And it's somewhere in between on the sustainability dimension, right? And so that's what I'm challenging all of us here today to do. And we've already heard some great presentations today that get at some of these metrics and some of these approaches. But I think moving forward, this will be a strong topic for discussion, how we include quantifiable and performance-based metrics for equity and associate that with the performance of the grid. Okay, so with that, we will turn over to our first speaker, who is Heather Moline, and I'm gonna allow you guys to pretty much introduce yourselves. So I've mentioned who you're with, Northwest Energy Coalition, but Heather, please introduce yourself and the floor is yours. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Folks can hear me okay? I am calling in from west of the coastal range, so I'm happy to have internet access currently. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Heather Moline. I'm a policy associate with Northwest Energy Coalition, and I think a lot of you are familiar with us, but we're a membership-based nonprofit. We work for a clean, reliable, affordable, and equitable energy.
Has Heather locked up for the rest of you?
Yep, it looks like, of course, she had to say, yep, glad to have internet, but it sounds like the connection isn't great.
Because
So why don't we move to the next speaker while we wait for Heather to call in? Does that work for everyone? So the next speaker is Tina Jayawira from Northwest Power and Conservation Council. Tina, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sounds great. Thanks, Tina.
Okay, great, thanks. So if you could go to the next slide. So I suspect many of you don't know my organization, the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. So I wanted to spend a few minutes giving some background and context, because I think it's important as we go into the larger discussion, where I'm coming from. So the Northwest Power and Conservation Council was formed in 1980 through an act of Congress, US Congress, called the Northwest Power Act. And basically what it did is it authorized the 4 states of the Northwest, Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and Montana, to work together to develop a regional power plan and a fish and wildlife program. So for those of you not informed of our region, we have some pretty big rivers in this area. We have the Columbia River system, which includes the Columbia River and the Snake River and some other smaller rivers. Along these rivers, back in the New Deal era, a number of power dams were built, and the idea of these dams were to help electrify the region. So many rural communities were able to have electricity from the building of these dams. And the Bonneville Power Administration is what markets the power from the dams. And so in 1980, the Power Act was formed, and it created the council, and our role is to look at the next 20 years for power planning to help ensure that we have an adequate, efficient, economical, reliable power system for the future. Coupled with that, we have a Fish and Wildlife Division, and their main goal is to protect and mitigate and enhance the fish and wildlife that were impacted by the dams when they were put in. Particularly the salmon runs had been decimated over the years, a large part due to those dams. And we need to do all this in a public process, because in the 70s, many decisions about the power system were done behind closed doors without engagement from the public to what the future of the power system would be like. So the 3 tenets are the power, the fish and wildlife, and the public process. My focus is on the power systems, so most of my conversation will be around how we think about our long-term power needs for the region. So where does this fit into the conversation about equity? If you could go to the next slide. Because one of our tenets is this public process, we are seen within the region as being a convener. So we work with a broad range of stakeholders, both on the power side and the fish and wildlife side. We have, on the power side, I think 10 advisory committees. All of our meetings are open to the public. We have, when we release our power plan, for example, we have a 60-day comment period, and all of our advisory committees are under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And so we work with a broad range of stakeholders, and so utilities and public interest groups. I think we've had a lot of conversation in this workshop with the tribes. On the fish and wildlife side, they work very closely with the tribes. I think we could do better on that side, on the power side. But we also try to engage as many stakeholders as we can to help ensure that we're doing our work as best as we can. We can certainly do better, but we can help further conversations that require a more regional look rather than an independent utility look, for example. We're also considered as an independent authority. So I think all of us on staff take it very much to heart that the work that we do needs to be independent, and that we don't want to show bias or have bias in our results, and that we rely on the data. So again, coupled with the convener role, that we can work to discuss issues without being thought of as being an advocate in any way, except under our mission of an adequate, efficient, economical, reliable power system. So the work that we've done thus far, we could certainly do more. We have thought about this question of equity, I think mostly in the area of energy efficiency. But in this most recent power plan that we're working on, we were tasked to think about this a little bit more broadly, think about how equity fits into the larger work of power planning in general. And one step that we took on this path is that we held what we call a systems integration forum back in February to explore how one might consider questions about equity in power planning, diversity, equity, and inclusion in power planning. And we had a lot of good ideas. When you get the presentation, this will be a link to the page, and there was some really great presenters that we had invited. So I encourage many of you to look at that. You might have some interesting findings from there. I certainly did. And then this is leading to the release of our next power plan. We're anticipating the draft to be out in August, about 2 months from now. And that will likely include language about thinking about where are there gaps to understand the equity question. So how well do we know if equity is being achieved? And if we don't know, what data do we need to help fill those gaps? And we envision this going through regional workshops, maybe something like this, working with PNNL, in helping further the conversation regionally, bringing in regional utilities and other stakeholders, and understanding what data they have, what data they need, and maybe there can be some cross collaboration to help further that discussion. And that's my last slide. So I'm happy to take any quick questions or turn it over to either Heather if she's back, or Usman.
Thanks, Tina. And since you finished about a minute early, I think we have time for a quick question. Of course, my dogs are talking too. So we do have one question in the chat from Wendell in Holland, talking about some utilities that are maybe slower to adopt renewable energy in the Pacific Northwest, and whether NPCC has any strategies for addressing those types of utilities, and maybe with an eye towards equity as well. So we do know that mitigating climate change has some equity components to it, right? Because climate change tends to affect the most vulnerable among us. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, so our main statutory authority is with the Bonneville Power Administration, which is mostly hydro. They do have one nuclear plant, but they are basically a carbon-free resource. For the investor-owned utilities, we have a role that varies depending kind of on how the regulatory commissions in each state use our work. And per my comment about being an independent authority, I think a lot of the commission staff do, follow our work and help use it to inform them. I see the comment, of course, that that was focused on Idaho Power, which does have actually a clean energy goal. And I don't have the date on top of head, but I think their intent is to be 100% clean by 2040, 2045, maybe. And so just recognize that they are moving towards a clean goal. So our work really is to rely on the data and the analysis. And so we look at what it takes to provide the adequate, efficient, reliable economic power system at a low cost. And we are seeing in our most recent plan that renewable energy has come down pretty significantly. And so that, coupled with energy efficiency, which has been a priority resource for us over the last 40 years, that is, what we say as being where the region should move forward. So we have, that kind of messaging to go out and the data to support why it would be important to invest in those resources.
That's great. Thanks, Tina. So in the interest of time, we're going to move to our next speaker, Uzma Siddiqui with Seattle City Light. Uzma, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. As Robbie said, my name is Uzma Siddiqui. I'm the Senior Manager for Grid Modernization at Seattle City Light. I've been with City Light about 18 years, a bunch of different engineering roles, starting from doing service connections to working in standards to working in distribution planning and transmission planning. So that's a little about me. Seattle City Light, we serve about 1 million people in and around Seattle. And today my goal is to give you a little window into how we are working on planning and implementing a more equitable grid. So just a sound check. Doing okay?
You sound
Yes?
great, Uzma.
All right,
Yes.
thank you. I was once on a panel and I found out afterwards that no one could hear me. So I was like, that must have been truly boring. All right, so here we are. I wanted to just kind of throw out a couple of documents and just some, a few covers. Seattle City Light is a municipal utility, which means that we're a department of the city of Seattle. And how that kind of ends up being a part of our world is that the city's goals are our goals too. So Seattle has some aggressive decarbonization goals, especially in the area of transportation electrification. So the first document that you see there is the Climate Action Plan. We have been blessed with a pretty plentiful supply of electricity that's generated by hydropower. And hence this Climate Action Plan is really focused more on reducing carbon pollution from the transportation and building sectors. So that's a little different than perhaps in other parts of the country. This Climate Action Plan has many components because it is citywide. Some of the things that impact Seattle City Light is that there's a new innovative utility program that's a pay-for-performance pilot in which we're exploring energy efficiency as a service up to about 30 buildings, and we're hoping to unlock greater levels of energy efficiency. So it's a new way of doing energy efficiency for us. We also, as a part of the Climate Action Plan, there's a electric vehicle readiness ordinance, which ensures that new construction or renovation of parking structures is built with electric vehicle infrastructure. And that's going to make it easier, right? So that's a little snippet on the Climate Action Plan. The bottom kind of cover that I captured is the Transportation Electrification Strategic Investment Plan. And this is a City Light document, but it has city-wide engagement. And it's all about leading with our values and what we've stated for this TSIP is equity, making sure that we're using our race and social justice toolkit, which I'll talk about in just a second, and having extensive community outreach. And this document's about 150 pages, and in the back portion of it is mostly related to how the community outreach was done. Other value environment, it has carbon reducing goals. We want to reduce air and water pollution. And then for the grid, we want to make sure that we assess our system and really are investing strategically. So this transportation electrification strategic investment plan is kind of focused for Seattle. And so it's about personal vehicles, it's about fleets, it's about marine, it's about ports, and you'll see that the cover is actually a ferry. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And then the final list in the middle of those screenshots is the cover of our race and social equity toolkit. And I'm actually going to stop and just read what the vision is for this document. I want to make sure I get it right. Say it, no, don't mix up any of the words. So the vision of the Seattle Race and Social Justice Initiative is to eliminate racial inequality in the community. To do this requires ending individual racism, institutional racism, and structural racism. The Racial Equity Toolkit lays out a process and a set of questions to guide the development, implementation, and evaluation of policies, initiatives, programs, and budget issues to address the impact on racial equity. And this toolkit has actually been around since August of 2012. So in Seattle, racial equity is kind of, it's in our, it's foundational to the departments of the city of Seattle and to the community as a whole. What happens in this toolkit is it's a multi-step process that involves stakeholders, and our goal is to determine benefits and burdens. And then we want to create a situation with greater equity, or at least to minimize unintended consequences. Then we track the impacts, and towards, it's a full circle. So you're supposed to report back about the project to leadership. And another really cool feature is that each of our departments has a change team, a race and social justice change team. It's made up of volunteers, and they help people like me who are working on projects kind of to help us think outside the box that we put ourselves in sometimes, and help strategize. We also have 2 full-time advisors, full-time employees who help us with race and social justice efforts. So next slide. All right, the second part of my talk is really about how we're adapting our engineering and business practices towards this goal of a more equitable grid. And one thing that many people are doing is thinking about non-wires alternatives. Seattle City Light is focusing right now in an environmental justice community that is along the Duwamish Valley. The Duwamish is a working river, lots of medium and heavy duty industry there, but it's not just work, people live there also. So we want to make sure that we're improving the environment for our customers and our neighbors who live here. So non-wire solutions, we're starting to incorporate that into our planning. Right now it feels a little ad hoc, but we've recognized this potential value and are really figuring out how to add it to the planning process more consistently and formally. I started doing some outreach to consultants who potentially could help us kind of assess what our current planning process is and figure out how to slide some non-wire solution work.
Uzma?
Yeah.
Uzma, you have about 10 seconds left to wrap up, please.
Okay. Test bed in the Duwamish Valley. Our novel approaches that working with the Washington Clean Energy Fund, we've proposed a DC microgrid, and apologies for running over. I thought I was going to be slow. So.
No worries. And I don't see any comments in the chat. So if you want to take about 20 more seconds, if you have any last comments before we move to the next speaker.
Well, I wanted to just talk about the ferry project because I'm really excited about that. It's an opportunity for us to use a large utility scale power battery to help minimize the impact on the grid. Sometimes one ferry is charging, sometimes 2. And what we'd like to do is to use the battery to help the second ferry charge because they're only overlapping about half a dozen times a day. So just lots of great opportunities to try to impact the actual cost, the actual quality of life for people using energy storage.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Uzma. All right, and Jessica Lynn is our now third speaker in this session from OPower, so we'll hand it to Jessica.
Thanks so much, Bobby and Uzma. Can you hear me?
Yes, sounds great.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Lynn, and I'm so excited to be here today because equity in energy is an issue that I'm passionate about and have focused on throughout my career, having spent over a decade at the World Bank leveraging clean energy technologies to mitigate poverty. And I'm currently a product manager for the data engineering teams for Oracle Utilities OPower. Next slide, please. Prior to joining OPower, I led a team of data scientists at the National Renewable Energy Lab and for the US Department of Energy. And at the time, we were exploring what energy affordability is and how to measure it. What we found is that there's no widely accepted metric for an affordable electricity bill in the US. Affordability for the modern grid infrastructure has been defined as a system quality that ensures system costs and needs are balanced with the ability of the users to pay. That comes from the report by Taft. However, energy affordability has traditionally been studied from the supply side or cost effectiveness of investments versus the demand side or the ability of customers to pay. Emerging metrics aim to measure electricity affordability from the perspective of the cost burden faced by customers. However, attempts to quantify customer affordability have been limited in a number of ways. At the DOE, my research focused on quantifying affordability as a means to make access to energy more equitable. So the team that I worked with and I used US Census information and leveraged a machine learning technique to develop what we call the ability to pay index. It was basically a proxy for available budget. It was one's income minus the housing costs. We used that index and compared it to all of the data sets that you see on the right and found that there was a statistically significant correlation between one's ability to pay and education level, mortality level, one's renter tenure, whether you own or rent, and the vintage or age of one's home. Experts have found that the key challenge of quantifying affordability in the absence of defining vulnerability or relying solely on poverty thresholds is that the resultant policies may target moving households above the poverty threshold rather than creating programs that can have the greatest impact on social welfare or meet the needs of those most deeply impoverished. And this issue will hold for the three pillars that Bobby pointed out at the start, for efficiency, resiliency, and sustainability. With this background, I moved to Oracle Utilities OPower in 2018, where I was able to leverage the data on behalf of our 100 utility clients across the country. Next slide, please. For those who are unfamiliar with Oracle Utilities OPower, we affectionately refer internally to ourselves as the overlap of the Venn diagram between computer science, data science, and behavior science. OPower was founded by an experiment by the behavioral professor Cialdini after the California brownouts in early 2000. His experiment proved that a normative comparison of one's energy use to one's neighbor could incent statistically significant behavior change. OPower was acquired by Oracle in 2016, and we remain a mission-driven organization that has saved nearly 30 terawatt hours of energy for our utility customers, our utility clients and their customers, excuse me. Our North Star has always been accelerating the clean energy future and therefore decarbonization. But we know that equity and affordability could be real barriers to decarbonizing the demand side. We have always supported limited income savings waves and have found that limited income customers save as much, if not more, than other demographic groups. This could be because their homes are not as well weatherized or because they're incented to save power as a means to save costs as well. Prior to COVID, over 60% of American households could be categorized as low or moderate income. But after the pandemic, when unemployment rates skyrocketed to levels last seen during the Great Depression, these households and the utilities that serve them are in an even more acute situation. Today, approximately a third of households are having trouble paying their bills, and it's expected that after the moratoriums lift, utilities could be left with over $40 billion in arrearages. For this reason, OPower will leverage our computer science, data science, and behavioral science techniques over this year to create a new offering specific to limited income customers to improve affordability for all customers. Our solution will include access to data to help utilities hyper-personalize communication, status alerts for customers to educate themselves and to help manage their bills, and a savings hub, which will put customers in touch with the funding sources that they need. With that, Bobby, I hope that my time is not out. How am I doing?
No, you're doing great. You have about 2 minutes, 2.5.
Okay. Well, that was what I had. I'll see if there are any questions though in the chat.
No, I think this is great, Jessica, and we'll be talking in the Q&A session about some of the metrics work. Did you have any comments on how to quantify trade-off between the different aspects of equity within the power system?
That's a great question. Could you elaborate though for me, please, Bobby? What do you mean by the trade-offs?
Sure, thinking about maybe doing better in one dimension, but intervention that causes you to do worse in another dimension. Are you able to reveal some of those trade-offs?
Sure, from the O-Power perspective or?
Yeah, why not?
Sure. Well, actually, if we can step back, rather than trade-offs, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about some of the challenges to even defining and quantifying what the issue is. Would that work for you?
Sure, absolutely.
I just remember, Bobby, that you brought up this idea of energy burden, for example. And part of why we took a different take on the metrics and analytics that we looked at the time was because even energy burden, which is an emerging metric, is one that is based on this idea that an affordable burden would be 6%, right? This assumes that you spend 30% of your income on housing costs and 20% of that on utilities. And 1 in 4 1 in 4 renters could actually spend more than 70% of their income on housing costs, right? And so I just bring up this example because when you start to think about trade-offs, particularly on the customer demand side, before you get to the supply side, right? It leads to a really challenging situation for customers when we think about affordability as opposed to a poverty threshold, right? Affordability means how much can you afford for a basket of goods, and that will change if you're in New York or San Francisco where costs are higher. And so what you see are families are actually in dire situations where they are actually choosing between medical bills and expenses and food as opposed to electricity, right? And so from our perspective, when we incent efficiency, we think that it is, we work very closely with our UX experts to have empathetic messaging to ensure that we are educating customers about the benefits of saving, but not stepping over this threshold where one could be in danger of, what is called the heat or eat phenomenon, or risking personal health because of it. Is that helpful in terms of a trade-off?
I think that's great. And we do have a question there in the moderated session. So I think that's a good start, Jessica. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I think now we'll turn back to Heather. Heather, let's do a quick sound check for you.
I think we're okay. Can you hear me?
You sound great. And so again, Heather Moline with with Northwest Energy Coalition. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you. And we'll do our best here. Wish me luck, folks. I apologize. Heather Moline, Policy Associate with Northwest Energy Coalition. We are about 100 members strong, a nonprofit that works for a clean, reliable, affordable, and equitable energy system. We mostly work in the utility sector. And in the last few years, more and more of our capacity has been going towards, I love this acronym, JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which of course has started with an internal and more human resources look at ourselves, our organization, our membership, which tends to be white-led, has historically been white-led. And not only building capacity and training for people to understand and participate in the utility sector, So that has included environmental justice organizations, community-based organizations, community action agencies, tribal sovereigns, but also equally important and less talked about, working with utility and regulatory staff, commissioners, utility executives, because often we say, you know, we're ready for more diverse participation, but when people are at our table, we're not really sure what we're doing, and we haven't really examined the power dynamics in the room to make sure those folks feel welcome and heard, and as if this is a table for them as well. So some of that internal stuff we've put into practice in those 3 policy related bullets. You heard Tina speaking about one of them. And in a bit, I'm going to say a little bit more about Washington and Oregon legislation. But before that, if we could go to the next slide. Let's just talk a little about advancing equity in utility business practices more generally. So we're talking on a policy level here. There is a lot that utilities are doing without legislative direction to improve equity in their business practices. I'm reminded there was a NARUC webinar on race and COVID-19 impacts, and the panelists were asked, should energy regulation be a form of social policy? And one of the commissioners was on the panel, a Black man, very pointedly said, okay, this should not be a should question. Utilities make social decisions all the time. So like it or not, what we are doing is social policy, and we just need to learn to do it a little better. Some of what's been happening in that arena without legislative direction is there have been great efforts, especially since the crazy events of the last couple years, to improve procedural equity in utility and regulatory processes. And I think philanthropies too are funding community-based organizations specifically to show up in the utility space now. So we see greater support and greater expertise coming from community-based environmental justice organizations who have been there all the time. They just haven't been funded to do so pointedly as well as they are now. And I think we're also seeing from utility staff, from commission staff, a realization that, you know, we're used to hiring people with certain skill sets, but there are some skill sets that can't be learned. You can't learn it through a 9-month training and probation program. This is lived experience that comes from decades of having lived through the very problems we're tackling. And people are being hired and retained and put into leadership differently. I think we always come back to a perceived barrier, which is, you know, what is the public interest, and how is affordability different from equity, and what can we do if we're only supposed to address the former? And I think we all know that sometimes when you fund a program or a rate or design a rate to benefit a certain group of people, costs can go up for everyone else. So sometimes we see these things as opposed. So some of the legislative direction that has helped folks get past this barrier. The first, I'm sure you all are familiar with this, but just to make sure it's spoken into this space, is Washington's Clean Energy Transformation Act. And it says, among other things, that the equitable distribution of energy burdens, energy benefits, and reduction of burdens, is now considered part of the public interest, as are energy security and resiliency, which is what we're here talking about. It also says, the law says, there should not be an increase in environmental health impacts to highly impacted communities, which the Washington State Department of Health has identified. This is very, very pointed, and there are a lot of states around the country that are saying, thank you for this example, because now we know maybe a direction that we are able to go now that it's written out. But of course, there's a lot of implementation happening that can get very messy that we're participating in. And then the second thing I would highlight is the Energy Affordability Act, HB 2475, which I actually had very little to do with, so I'm not going to claim any of this had to do with me. One of my colleagues, and particularly community-based and environmental justice organizations in Oregon, have made this happen. Finally, it has passed the legislature. And it says that basically in classification of services for utilities, meaning, for example, in rate making, we can take into account burdens on low-income customers or other environmental justice factors that affect affordability. So that's one of the things it says. And it also says that intervenor funding may be provided to organizations who represent the interests of members of environmental justice communities, which can include a whole bunch of communities that are listed in the law that passed. So when this goes to implementation, we are hoping it will lead to, among other things, the possibility of a low-income rate class, as well as meaningful financial support to organizations and people who face huge barriers when they want to participate at the commission. And we're definitely going to say more in the Q&A about how this is coming into play at the utility level, but that's all I had on my slides for now.
I think that's perfect. Thanks, Heather. So I think now we're going to turn to the moderated Q&A part of the discussion. And I've got 3 questions here. And in the interest of time, we're going to try to get to them all quite quickly. We also have a couple of questions in the chat. So the 3 questions that I want us to think about are working towards developing and using metrics within planning that quantify equity. 2, thinking about how to make the process itself more equitable. This gets at the procedural component that I think Rebecca hit at yesterday. And 3, including equity specifically within resilience planning. So let's put the slides away now and have us all show up on the screen. An additional question here is for Jessica Lynn from Jackie Moss in the chat. So for Jessica, Jackie is familiar with the ability to pay index, but is OPower able to use that index to identify communities that may be opportunities for programmatic investments?
Absolutely. So I've actually responded in the chat to Jackie Moss, but in addition to the ability to pay index, we use a variety of different energy affordability metrics, ranging from the vintage of the home to, the renter tenure and others, to help our utility clients send the right message to the right customer at the right time, and for their own purposes. We also make all of our data transparent to our customers for the purpose of their own use.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. So the next question is from me to Heather. Heather, how are you working towards developing and using actual quantifiable metrics within planning that may measure the impact of our energy system in some of these other equity dimensions, like access to clean energy solutions and availability of well-paying jobs and that type of thing?
Awesome, thank you, yeah. So I appreciate what some panelists have said, that energy burden, right, which is how much of your income do you spend on your bill, is very important, but it really is a downstream metric, right? Why are people not able to afford their bills in the first place? We don't have enough standardized data about this. So we do need to start thinking about measuring distributed generation and storage and energy efficiency access within utility service territories across demographic categories. These are really hard questions that take a lot of capacity for us to answer. I don't want to shirk away from that. But access to long-term resources like that are really what reinforce the wealth that some of us have and prevent it from taking root elsewhere. So as an example of this, I've been really impressed by the work of Portland General Electric in the distribution system planning realm. So among other things, they contracted with 3 different community-based organizations who all serve communities of color in their service territory. And they co-developed a community engagement plan as part of their distribution system plan. And as one sort of outcome of all of these conversations, the engineers at PGE presented a layered map of their service territory where you can see distribution system capacity and feeder location overlaid with things like demographic data, like poverty level. It isn't perfect. The boundaries of each layer don't match up very well. Some of the measurements aren't meaningful currently. But what I really liked was that the engineers and the distribution team said, we heard that you all wanted something like this, so we just kind of created this thing. What do you think? And can we go from here? And I think sometimes we find analysts and engineers, like, tell us what you want and we'll create it, rather than can we just create a thing and then get feedback on it, because we are the people with the technical skills and you all are able to mold it based on what you really need.
I like that. Tina, anything to add on the metrics piece?
I think just to follow a little bit more on what Heather said, one of the projects that we did a few years ago, working with a lot of regional utilities, is to try to identify where the underserved communities are. So different utilities do a better or worse job in reaching a certain demographic or a certain building type in identifying the energy efficiency needs. And so when we worked with the different utilities, they had different levels of granularity for their data. Some collected a lot of demographic information, some collected very little demographic information. And I think one of the outcomes from that work was, learning from each other, learning where the gaps are, and then thinking about, well, how do I define whether this group is underserved or not? How do I determine if it's achieved an equitable amount of energy efficiency? There's always more efficiency that could be done, but are they being served equitably compared to this other group? And this was, I think, part of maybe the seed for what I talked about, thinking about this on a more broader planning level. So not just on energy efficiency, but also think about maybe distributed generation or even larger facility siting and issues like that. And how do you know whether you're being equitable or not in achieving your goals and serving your customers, and understanding where the data are or are missing, and how can we work together to better it for everybody?
Yeah, that makes sense. We do have a question in the chat from Stephen Sondheim. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Stephen. Talking about, if you've got some of these metrics and you understand how to measure some of the benefits in these categories that speak to equity, how do we think about incentives to the utilities to solve some of these problems? Maybe Uzma or Heather?
Well, I'll just say that as a municipal utility, we don't really, our incentive is that we do good.
Right.
That's just part of baked into being a department, kind of plug for public power. That's the advantage of public power. We're just, our intent is to do good, or at least that's mine.
So Stephen, your answer is live in Uzma service territory.
Please, it's a lovely place to live. Except for yesterday, which was a little warm.
I don't think that's the only answer.
No, not at all.
And
it's just my answer.
Internet might be a little shoddy right now, but definitely a lot of that starts with strong presence at the legislature, and conversations about different models for regulation, and not necessarily advocating for those strongly, but at least asking utilities, if you, and I guess if we're talking about investor-owned utilities, if you could be supported to do things, what would you be supported to do? And how can we start with that and take that to our legislature?
Yeah. So I want to kick it back to Jessica for the next question, to think about, if, let's say you can quantify equity, how are you going to do that? And specifically, if you could help us think about that resilience dimension of equity. So keeping the lights on for the people that need it most in critical disruptions, because we do know that battery storage and energy storage in general can be critical during those disruptions, and resilience can be a key piece of the equity impact for storage.
Thanks so much, Bobby. Yeah, so for the first part of your question around metrics, one of my favorite books is Measure What Matters by John Doerr. He just sort of posits that what you focus on expands, right? And until we define energy equity, it's difficult for us to address it. And so from the OPower perspective, we're interested in helping utilities to make access to the energy more affordable. And I just want to point out that distinction in terms of how we're defining energy equity. What we found is that utilities have challenges identifying limited income customers and creating awareness of income qualified programs, because there actually is funding available for customers and many don't know about it. So in terms of sustainability, it makes sense for the utility to want to be able to have their bills paid for their revenue, just beyond doing good. However, LMI efficiency programs are expensive to administer, and utilities struggle with complex inter and intra-organal coordination. And as a result, it's fractured and inadequate in terms of the LMI customer experience at times. So OPower aims to solve those problems by absorbing the complexity and creating a simple, effective, limited income customer experience. A complete view of the customer's financial and energy consumption picture will make our solution a bit different, and a personalized, easy customer journey from inequity to long-term savings, energy savings and affordability will make our solution unique. So we have 4 primary metrics for success of our limited income program, which is enrollment in financial assistance programs, percent, how many more limited income energy savings delivered, improvements in the dollar per kilowatt hours of LMI energy savings delivered, and higher customer sat among LMI customers. We've also found that equity and affordability are political imperatives for utilities, but in practice, utilities are not in full control of delivering those outcomes. So in cases where assistance programs are constrained by external funding and program operations, the best utilities can do is lead their customers to those programs. We think that doing this will serve 3 purposes: alleviating political pressures, removing bottlenecks in delivering on the primary metrics, and clearly showing the magnitude of the need for low-income assistance program funding in the communities that they serve. So we also want to measure how many more vulnerable customers were identified and prioritized. We mentioned the ability to pay, but we are using a variety of metrics to do so. Increased awareness of income eligible assistance programs, how many more customers are confirmed in these for assistance, and how many more applications for income eligible assistance are submitted. Finally, by proactively engaging LMI customers and influencing them to act in ways that reduce their energy bills, we expect to deliver value to utility customers, operation leaders. So we also have sort of tertiary metrics around reduced arrearages, fewer LMI customer calls, and fewer shutoffs. So that's speaking specifically to the metrics around our goals for our programs. But to your point about resilience, OPower has moved beyond energy efficiency, right? And we do want to help customers save energy at the right time. And so we think in terms of resilience, how can you mitigate the need for resilience, right? So I think that BGE, one of our clients, is a great example of one that has been able to leverage peak time rebates in their territory. They have it territory-wide, and customers are able to participate in grid resilient activities like decreasing their usage during peak events for the grid. BGE is able to get paid for decreasing load by the ISO, and they're able to pass this money on to customers who choose to participate. I think that that's a great way that and more utilities should incorporate similar peak time rebates in grid planning, not only to equitably share the gains from decreasing usage, but also to increase education about the need to share resources, irrespective of your income level. Behavioral demand response programs also have the benefit of reaching out to all customers. They're not limited to any income group, and they don't have to have smart thermostats or EV or water heaters. So it's a very accessible program. To the extent that installed measures are necessary, I do think that there are a number of equitable programs, such as the pay-as-you-save model. Traditionally, this has happened more through co-ops, right, where pays requires a regulatory rate approval, but it would offer payments to utilities for deferred peak charges, payments to customers in the form of installed measures, and decrease bills, but most importantly, it does so in a way that customers don't have to repay the cost of the measures themselves, but they do it through lower bills and without the risk of predatory lending. So while this has traditionally happened through co-ops, you're seeing it now at places like Ameren, Centerpoint, and Evergy as well. So those.
Thanks, Jessica. Tina, any comments on the resilience piece? Are you thinking of resilience and equity within the same lens?
We are certainly thinking about that. So because we're a regional organization and we plan regionally, we do miss, I think, some of the utility specific nuances, but just some examples of how we are thinking about it in our current plan. So in our current plan, as I mentioned earlier, renewables and energy efficiency are the main resources needed to go forward. And renewables is primarily on the utility scale, because when you start thinking about distributed power, it becomes a little bit more expensive, at least compared to a lot of EE that can be done. So focusing in on energy efficiency, once we are finished with the plan, it will include a energy efficiency target for the region to achieve. And coupled with that, we include a formulation of how to determine going forward whether a measure is cost effective relative to the plan findings or not. And as we were thinking about this for the upcoming plan, we wanted to consider the different value streams of efficiency that we hadn't necessarily accounted for going into it. And as we know, this past year in the Northwest particularly, we've had a lot of fairly extreme events. We had wildfires, we had ice storms, and this past week we've had heat waves that have all impacted homes, to a varying degree. And it seems that energy efficiency can support resilience. We've heard a little bit about this in the past 2 days, where a home, for example, that is well insulated can outlast this extreme event better than a poorly insulated homes. And we also know that energy efficiency is becoming more of a cost constraint compared to renewable resources. So as we're going forward and thinking about how to do EE, we need to be more targeted in it, and we can't just do the broad brush LED lighting programs that we've been so dependent on in the past that have been very low cost and very effective, but are hitting people who go to Home Depot to buy a light bulb, but may not capture it very equitably across the population. And so all this boils down to, as we're thinking about how to think about the cost effectiveness for energy efficiency, one of the metrics we're considering is a resilience metric. So basically including this valuation for resiliency so that measures that offer this benefit can better serve these pocketed households and that thus be cost effective compared to other measures. It will be challenging for the utilities to find these homes, and I think programs like O-Powers can help in that regard to identify these high users and help the utilities kind of hone in on the heat maps needed to find the homes that need this the most, and not necessarily only the ones that historically have had arrearages or need income assistance in their bill pay. It basically wanting to think about where the homes are, how to find them, and serving them in the best way to withstand kind of the extreme events that we're experiencing more and more.
Yeah, and I've got a lot of thoughts on metrics, but I see Rebecca's popping in here. So I think it's probably time to wrap up, and I want to thank all of our panelists today, Tina, Jessica, Uzma, Heather. Thank you guys so much for your great presentations and your comments. And I'm going to kick it. Should I kick it, Rebecca, over to Bethel for the next panel?
Thank you.
Yes, please. I'll help you with that. Yeah, if you want to kick it over to the next panel.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions. Thank you, Bobby, for leading us through that.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you indeed.
All right, we're transitioning into the final panel of the entire conference, a roundtable. Bethel Terracain from PNNL will be moderating. Please do take a look at the agenda to make sure you know who's who, and all of the bios again are available to you online. Bethel, are you available to get us started as we add your panelists?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca.
Great.
Hi, everyone. I am Bethel Tarakin, and I work at PNNL with Rebecca. I support our energy equity research efforts at the lab. I will be moderating this next session on energy storage as an equity asset. So the title actually for this session was initially, inspired by a paper we wrote here at the lab, which is part of the pre-reader that are accessible on our event website. And our goal with that paper was, to try and think through technology design, development, and implementation, in this case, energy storage, through an equity lens. And in this next session, I want to build on that paper and then, have a discussion with the four of our panelists here today to extend our understanding of energy equity and the role of storage in that conversation. So the main question I want to, get at, or I want us to target here today is, how can energy storage deployment respond to local environmental, health, and community needs in general? So to start the session, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves, and they will give us their presentations as well. After that, I will ask questions from my end and integrate any questions from the audience. So for those of you in our audience, if you have any questions to the panelists, please continue putting those in the chat, and I will try to integrate them. With that, I think I will transition to the presentations. I will have Julia start, Jeremy will follow. I don't see Jeremy here, then Abby and Elena. Before I continue, I want to ask Savannah, do you have everyone here? Let's make sure we have all our panelists, and then we can continue to Julia. I see Julia and Abby.
I'm here now. This is Jeremy.
Okay, great. Do we have Elena as well?
I'm here as well. Hi.
Great. Awesome. So Julia, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much, Bethel. And hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. I'm thrilled. Can you hear me okay? Since I'm
Yes.
Great. All right, awesome. And Embry, it's great to see you again. We worked together at the Department of Energy a few years ago. So it's wonderful to be part of this discussion and to be part of the community. I was able to jump in to part of the discussions yesterday, and it was really exciting to hear the community focus and the interest and the responsibility to share data and to access data and to really start building our own roles and responsibilities to making sure we have the technical capacity in local leaders, state leaders, and federal leaders, and to start acknowledging that there's silos and how to help some of the silos build where they are being equitable, and how to connect some of the silos where we need more continuity and that connective tissue. And so I'm really excited to be here today to introduce and talk about the Long Duration Energy Storage Association of California. We've been around for a little over a year and a half, and we are working with other associations in California to promote California's clean energy goals. There's a lot to do. We need everything. And so one thing that we're noticing is that there's not a lot of understanding or knowledge of the diverse energy technologies that are for long duration energy storage. So we're promoting long duration energy storage, the diverse technology needed to meet California's clean energy goals. We partner with other stakeholders and organizations to advance our shared priorities. We're enhancing California's ability to meet the climate goals while operating a safe, reliable, and clean grid. And we're doing that with diverse stakeholders. So as you see above, I added all of our different logos of our organizations. There are over 17 different types of companies that range from startup to been around for decades, trying to promote the importance of long duration energy storage. And I've included a table that I'll highlight, but you can also go into more detail on our website to acknowledge that there's a diverse types of energy storage that exist, both short-term, and short-term batteries and lithium ion are really important, but we need more than just for our batteries. We need more for the for when the lights go off and when the sun goes down and the wind stops, how do you fill those gaps? And long duration energy storage really can elongate the solar and wind duration on the grid. And we do that through diverse technologies that can both be behind the meter and in front of the meter. It really can kind of plug and play. Many of these technologies can fit in existing gas infrastructure facilities. They can kind of replace the existing infrastructure, use some of it, recycle and repurpose. They can be, put in various communities around California, around the country. So it's very exciting to kind of see that there's a diverse set of long duration energy storage that can meet the goals that we have as a state and as a nation. There are thermal batteries. Again, we're defining as an association long duration energy storage as kind of the sweet spot is 10-hour and more. So you can be 10 hours, 24 hours, multi-day, weekly and seasonally. And so these technologies that I highlight here on the table, thermal batteries, their average life cycle is 30 years, their durations at 20 hours, they're market ready. There's many companies that are working with Department of Energy and others in the labs on making sure that they're providing these ancillary services to the grid, not just providing traditional storage, but providing grid stabilization, frequency control, resource adequacy, black start capability, synchronous generation, their frequency regulation. There are so many attributes that long duration energy storage provides that also helps decrease emissions, keeps the lights on, helps prepare us for the climate emergency, really adds the resiliency to the grid and local communities and system-wide benefits. Equity is a huge part of our association's mission and our working with all these developers. It's really important since we're doing some things new and adding on to existing processes, how to build into the existing system improvements, to really make sure we're having community involvement, we're including equity, we're really talking to customers and sharing data and information and insights to making the whole process better and more equitable. We're also working with the various types of technologies that have been around for a while, like pump storage, that has proven itself valuable time and time again, but you can't build that everywhere. So what can you do with other types of technology? Compressed air, concentrated solar thermal, liquid air, green hydrogen, and flywheel technology, flow batteries, and zinc batteries. And gravity. There are new types of technologies that build from the technology advancements of pump storage and producing different types of gravity processes for long duration energy storage. There are some in particular that take existing pump jack facilities where oil or gas have been refined and use the infrastructure to move either water or liquid up and down and use that for long duration energy storage. So again, it's exciting to see all these different types of technologies like zinc batteries being able to be stackable and being used in communities that have been devastated by wildfires and bring back service online and also help with telecom. And so again, it's that partnership that's so essential. And another aspect of long duration energy storage that's so key is that we've been in the market, but we're also trying to expand the market. And we're really thrilled that the California Public Utilities Commission voted unanimously last week for 1,000 megawatts of procurement for long duration energy storage. So getting those market signals is really important to bring on these different types of long duration energy storage to the grid and making sure that this process from the forefront is more equitable and inclusive. Having more representatives at the table early is critical to the success of having a clean, reliable grid that is equitable and inclusionary. Also lowering costs, because long duration energy storage promotes clean energy and helps keep wind and solar online longer and geothermal and other aspects of clean energy. It really does keep the cost down, and it does help the interconnected economy of, we're not just looking at electricity, we're looking at the entire decarbonization of the economy, and how does long duration energy storage really help fit the electric vehicle infrastructure, the building infrastructure, the commercialization infrastructure, the neighborhood infrastructure. So all these different pieces, again, looking at the connective tissue. And again, the benefits, the health benefits, decreasing emissions, really bringing down the asthma rates in so many communities that have been harmed in California. And so all these different attributes are now part of our conversation and part of the development of how we bring into long duration energy storage. I'm going to go to the next slide, please, to kind of highlight that we've had many state laws that have passed recently, SB 350, SB 535, SB 5, or AB, and SB is Senate bill and AB is Assembly bill, that have really started to acknowledge the importance of the the disadvantaged communities and low income communities and tribal communities who've been on the forefront for decades and saying these strong messages time and time again, and how important it is to make sure that the various communities their interests, their needs are all incorporated into all this new clean energy infrastructure development. And so the SB 350 recently just passed 2019 created a advisory council, 11-member, that coordinates both the Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission on looking at what their regulatory policies are doing. And in the previous panel, it was great to hear a lot of the logistics and metrics and kind of the need for more data and information. And there is I've linked it in the slides, but the California Energy Commission has on their website, where I've gotten a lot of these maps of, really trying to build more of the information to discuss what does the current information look like. And the center of the grid, where you're looking at those green lines with a box, those are the transmission lines that exist today. And all those little yellow dots are the substations that are gas, combined cycle, and other. And it's looking at this map and realizing we have to replace and kind of re-energize with all these new types of infrastructure, including long duration energy storage, a new system. And how do we do that with diversity, equity, inclusion, and really taking in the leadership voices of the disadvantaged communities that have been harmed, as you see with the circles in the California map, affecting all the asthma rates. I mean, these are enormous visits, like daily, to the emergency room, the population going because of asthma harmed by the emissions in the air. And so, again, kind of connecting all these dots of why this is so important. And voices have been saying this for a long time. It's just, helping, elevate those voices and strengthen the need for changing the system. And so we're also in California working with, very different types of communities that have been disadvantaged, that have low income, that tribal communities that all have different interests in building clean energy infrastructure, and how to incorporate the different interests, the different infrastructure, and the needs, while providing emission-free technology and also low cost benefits. And then I think it's also interesting is that when you lay all these maps on top of each other, and as of right now, you can't quite do that, but I'm hoping that it will be soon in the future, is really kind of making sure that there's a huge swath of California that is affected by all these communities, and that they have these needs that have been misdirected or misunderstood. And so now it's really trying to take into the social equity framework of what developers, associations need to take into consideration when we're working on, changing the infrastructure, and how long duration energy storage can really help both behind the meter and in front of the meter from those 10 different technologies that I mentioned, and that there's so much more coming to fruition. But again, it's just really important to have this overall discussion about procurement, equity, access, and ensuring that we can kind of move this forward. So I'm really excited to continue the conversation and speak with my fellow panelists, and look forward to the questions and conversations. But again, thrilled to be here. Storage is a huge part of moving us forward to meet our climate goals and address equity and concerns and interests of disadvantaged communities and low income communities. So thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Jeremy, you're up.
Great. Well, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you. Thanks.
Just let me know. I've been struggling a little bit with internet connection today. So I'm Jeremy Richardson. I'm a senior energy analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I'll echo Julia in thanking PNNL for convening this and for leaning into this topic. And I appreciate the invitation to be here. I'll be relatively brief and looking forward to the discussion and the questions. And but I wanted to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing at UCS related to storage, and in particular, how to make policies make sure that they're equitable. So on the first slide, I laid out a couple of 6 questions that we sort of approached our work on storage. And so in 2018, we've been working on these issues for about 3 years, this particular subject. And in 2018, the end of the year, we convened a very diverse group of stakeholders to discuss what equitable deployment of energy storage means. And it was actually sort of a first of its kind group. I guess we had about 30 groups represented, and it included environmental justice and grassroots organizations. It included policy experts, It included industry folks, labor, consumer advocates, faith groups, and renewable energy advocates. So it's a pretty wide range of perspectives. And we looked at these 6 questions. So how can storage be deployed to reduce emissions and improve air quality? How can it be used to make communities and residents more resilient to disasters and power outages? What does it mean in the context of local economic development and jobs? How can it accelerate greater levels of renewables on the grid? What about the connection to reducing electricity bills? And how can policymakers ensure that communities have a voice and a seat at the table when policies are being developed? And so what that led to was a set of consensus principles on each one of these questions. And it was sort of a one-page document, but the interesting thing about it was that almost all of the groups that participated signed on to support that document. So it sort of laid a foundation for what we mean by equitable policies. And then so we've tried to build on that work, as we move forward. And so the next thing we did was we worked on a policy brief that dug a layer deeper into, what does that really mean if you're thinking about how to design and develop policies that support equitable deployment. So we came up with a set of actionable policy recommendations, and I can share later the links. It's not on the slide, but to the principles and then the follow-up policy brief that really think of it as kind of a menu of options. What kinds of things should policymakers be considering when they're thinking about different tools that are used to deploy energy storage? So things like, okay, well, if you set up a set of targets that are mandatory for utilities, what kinds of things should you think about? And that's, for example, carve-outs for disadvantaged communities. If you think about what are the incentives that might be available? How do you think about driving those incentives to benefit low income and communities of color? And then finally, what are some considerations about implementation and direction that you need to give to the regulatory agencies? So that was actually and then we had a set of recommendations in there for primarily aimed at state policymakers, but I think relevant to the federal context as well. So if you flip to my next slide, the thing that I wanted to sort of leave you with is that what we're trying to do is that we are in the process of producing another fact sheet, and this one will really dig even further into the sort of policy analysis in it, and it lays out a set of legislative examples. So what have other states done in the context of what's possible in their states? So you can see different examples, and the idea is that will help policymakers think of ways or language that they can then put into the context for their state and potentially use. So the idea is that this would be a resource that not only UCS could use in its advocacy work in the states where we work, but that also allies could use in their own work. And so I'll just name that we've done a pretty significant stakeholder outreach process to make sure that we're not speaking for environmental justice communities, we're not speaking for affected communities. We're really trying to get input, get buy-in, make sure that we're creating something that's useful to folks on the ground. So for this particular fact sheet, they'll be coming out, I think, in August or September. The focus is on 3 particular aspects, use cases for storage, and those are replacement of peaker plants, increased resiliency, and reducing greenhouse gases and criteria air pollutants. And there's some other pieces that you can think of that are really important that are sort of more cross-cutting. So for example, how do you define a disadvantaged community, what kinds of things do you need to include to ensure that there's a robust stakeholder engagement process? What sorts of things do regulators need to see in the law so that they have enough guidance to really think about and consider equity dimensions and labor standards? So yeah, I think that that's basically what I wanted to offer, and can circle back to share links later.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, thank you. Elena?
Hey, thank you, and good to be here. Thank you, everyone. My name is Elena Krieger, and I am the Director of Research at Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy. We are an energy science and policy research institute based out of Oakland, California, and we do research on health and environmental impacts of energy resources and on clean energy transitions, and in particular, how to accelerate clean energy transitions in a way to realize health, environment, equity, and other co-benefits in that process. We also work with a broad range of stakeholders, from community organizations to policymakers and regulators, to understand and use science to drive data-driven energy policymaking. So I wanted to sort of open up today and talk about a few of the frameworks that we use for thinking about how to incorporate energy storage and other resources onto the grid, and realize some of these health and equity benefits. You'll see a lot of these echo some of the same points that Jeremy talked about earlier. I'm not going to touch on a few other important things, such as workforce development and important community engagement and process, but do want to uplift that those are important for a full sort of comprehensive set of frameworks and metrics in terms of achieving energy equity as we adopt energy storage. So I'm going to run through these metrics, and then I'll talk about a few of the projects that we're working on or have recently completed, and how we've applied those metrics to thinking about energy transitions. So one of the first, which others have touched on as well, of course, is the impact of energy storage and other energy resources on air pollution and air pollutants. So what are the impacts of the magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions, of criteria air pollutants, particulate matter, and so forth? Where are these being emitted? Who lives nearby, for example? What kinds of cumulative environmental or socioeconomic burdens are there on the populations that might be affected by these emissions? And the time of air pollutant emissions. When are these taking place in terms of poor air quality days, for example? So as you add energy storage, are you displacing power plants or displacing diesel generators that have these different kinds of impacts? The second component is thinking about economics, which we primarily do on a sort of household basis. So what are the economic impacts of distributed energy resources, storage, efficiency, and so forth on things like energy cost burdens, which we heard the previous panel talk about, and then who has access to that? So we see some of the highest energy cost burdens on some of our lowest income households, for example, particularly on populations of color in rural areas. Do those same communities actually have access to clean energy technologies? We've seen this hasn't really been true for things like rooftop solar. How do we change that for storage and other emerging resources? We look at resilience. So where do we site storage to provide resilience in the face of heat waves, wildfires, smoke? Here in California, we have public safety power shutoffs and grid outages to prevent wildfires, particularly for vulnerable populations like those with underlying health conditions and the elderly. And then, of course, life cycle considerations. Where are materials from that are used in these batteries and other types of storage devices? How are they processed? How are they disposed of at end of life? And then how can we integrate all of these together? Next slide, please. So 3 of the projects that we've been working on that integrate some of these metrics include, for starters, our energy storage peaker plant replacement project. For this, we analyzed opportunities and sort of prime candidates to replace peaker power plants, which are the power plants that come on maybe 5% of the time to meet peak electric demand, typically on hot summer days, across 9 different states. We looked at basic operational characteristics. How long do these things run? Are they good technical matches for things like energy storage? And then we looked at some of those metrics from the previous page. Which ones have the highest rate of emissions? Where are you going to get the greatest bang for your buck in terms of replacing peaker power plants, in terms of adding other kinds of clean energy technologies? We looked at who was living nearby, cumulative environmental, socioeconomic, and health burdens on those populations, and when they operated. So we found, for example, good candidates in California that operate 2/3 of the time on days that are already exceeding ozone standards in California, have some of the highest emission rates of any power plants in the state. They're located primarily in disadvantaged communities. Maybe that's a good place for us to start investing in storage and other alternative technologies. So we looked at that across 9 different states and incorporated that also into a set of interactive data tools. So anyone here can go and look up which sets of data are important to you, or which sets of data might be important to any given community in terms of emission rates or in terms of population, to make their own decisions in terms of how to prioritize those kinds of clean energy investments to displace peaking power plants. A second project that we're working on right now is identifying opportunities to create solar and storage resilience hubs at schools and community centers across the state of California. So we have identified and aggregated all of the schools, all the community centers, are calculating their solar and storage potential, and then thinking about how we would design resilient systems so that they provide backup for 1 day, for 3 days in the face of different kind of, say, climate impacts or power outages, or in different climate zones. And then we're taking a look at the populations that live nearby and say, well, how would we prioritize a subset of these solar and storage resilience hubs to make sure everyone lives within half a mile of a resilient site, or that our most vulnerable populations, whether that be from an income standpoint or what we define as disadvantaged communities here in California, or those facing the greatest heat waves moving forward, might be able to live within close travel distance of a resilient site. How do we prioritize those? We're also working with 2 community organizations, Communities for a Better Environment, working in Wilmington and Los Angeles, and the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. And they're identifying what resilience actually means in those communities above and beyond just the backup power from solar and storage, developing community toolkits for other communities to replicate some of their outreach efforts. And then we're working with them to identify 1 to 2 sites to design solar and storage backup at, again, community centers or schools, and taking those case studies and feeding them back up into our statewide analysis. And hopefully what that will do is help us set a roadmap for thinking about how we can implement and integrate solar and storage statewide to, again, increase resilience, particularly for some of our most vulnerable populations. And then finally, we're thinking about how to integrate some of these metrics into deep decarbonization planning. So we just finished, and we're ongoing for a couple of states, an analysis of integrating health and equity into deep decarbonization in Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico. Thinking very broadly about how do we adopt renewables, how do we adopt clean energy in a way that will reduce energy cost burdens, add resilience, and reduce pollution in some of the, again, vulnerable and overburdened communities. So as an example for that, the figure that I have up here is a map of Colorado that has a mix of different metrics on here: energy cost burdens, projected heat waves going forward, wildfire risk. And so if we pull together some of these metrics, we might be able to identify communities that are going to be facing difficult trade-offs on whether they're going to be able to afford air conditioning and their energy bill, or whether they're going to be facing risk of heat stroke and other kinds of climate impacts. And maybe that is where we want to target things like solar and storage, energy cost saving measures like efficiency, and so forth. So these are just a few examples, but sort of, I think, across the board as we're looking at both distributed storage and utility scale energy storage and other resources, whole suites of portfolios of technologies that we can start to bring in some of these additional health, environment, resilience, and equity metrics into the planning process. Thanks.
Thank you, Elena. Abby, you're next.
Hey. Thank you all, and a big thank you to PNNL for inviting me to speak on this very important topic. It's really great to see a national lab highlighting the many different facets of energy equity that need to be addressed. And I think that's been reflected in both the presentations we've had in the last 2 days and also in the presentations of my fellow panelists. And I think a lot of what I'll have to share will dovetail really nicely with a lot of things that have already been touched upon. So to introduce myself, my name is Abby Ramanan. I'm a project manager with Clean Energy Group. I'm actually one of 2 clean energy employees who splits my time between Clean Energy Group and our sister organization, the Clean Energy States Alliance, which gives me a bit of a unique opportunity to speak to both organizations. They are structured a little differently, but have both really centered equity in our core mission focus. So to provide a bit of background, Clean Energy Group is a national nonprofit based in Vermont, although we are nationwide, and I'm actually based in Maine. We are mostly privately funded by foundations, and our focus is on specifically expanding access to clean, resilient power for all, particularly historically underserved communities. While we do focus on other clean energy technologies, battery storage does play a huge role in almost all of our initiatives. I personally spend much of my time working through the Resilient Power Project, which was founded in 2009 in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. One thing we saw following Superstorm Sandy was that historically underserved communities tend to be the hardest hit by severe weather events. And I'll touch on that topic a little more in the next slide. But our work through RPP is really focused on providing targeted assistance to critical service providers in low income and otherwise historically marginalized communities to expand access to resilient power technologies, which in our case involves both battery storage and often pairing that with solar. We're also involved in advocating for the replacement of, as Elena mentioned, those super polluting peaker plants, many of which are often located in environmental justice communities, replacing those with battery storage and renewables through the Phase Out Peakers initiative. And then we are also really starting to look at how battery storage can play a role in equitable access to home health care. And that's also a topic I'll touch on a bit in the next slide. And then finally, we do a lot of work in sort of general energy storage policy, particularly with an emphasis on looking at the structural and regulatory barriers that are keeping battery storage from reaching underserved communities. And then on the Clean Energy States Alliance side, CESA is a membership organization of state offices that manage clean energy funds. We focus on all aspects of kind of clean energy initiatives that can be of use to our members. A lot of our battery storage work in particular is through our partnership with Sandia National Labs, through STAP, the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, and that aims to accelerate battery storage adoption through research and knowledge dissemination. Next slide, please. So it's obviously hard to kind of condense the vast structural inequalities that need to be addressed to create a more just energy system and an energy transition, particularly through battery storage. But I did want to highlight a few here that have, again, been touched upon by my previous panelists, and then provide a few recommendations and actions on the next slide. So one thing that we've seen a lot through our work with underserved communities is that energy burden can be a huge problem for upward mobility and wealth creation. And this takes on a few different aspects. I mean, among households, high energy burden really limits the ability to save and also makes low-income households more vulnerable to energy bill spikes and utility debt accumulation, which is something we've seen a lot of during COVID-19 and the unemployment that followed that. And then among critical service providers who are also working in those same communities, those organizations are often equally cash strapped and capacity strapped, and really limited in the services that they're able to offer within the community as a result of that. And both of these issues can be just a huge growth inhibitor and really do need to be addressed in any form of a just energy transition. And then healthcare and emergency preparedness is a really big, vast topic, but is definitely a huge area where equitable energy source distribution can mean, not just a better quality of life, but it can also save lives. As climate change worsens and severe weather events become more common, a lot of communities are already dealing with, sort of outdated and inefficient energy infrastructure. And during a severe weather event, they're only going to be more vulnerable and more likely to experience a long-term outage. In addition to sort of long-term outages, the impact of kind of more regular outages on quality of life is huge, and can lead to both, minor inconveniences to really catastrophic consequences. A good example of this is what we saw in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Outdated infrastructure there meant that many communities were without power for months after the hurricane and continued to deal with regular outages. CUG actually did a lot of work there, working with several stakeholders post-Maria to create better incentives and implementation opportunities for community and critical service facilities in Puerto Rico to be equipped with battery storage and solar. In places like Puerto Rico, where the grid is frequently not reliant even in a blue sky scenario, having access to clean energy alternatives is essential. I mean, it can ensure that, for example, a fire station can power their communication technology to literally be able to communicate with residents in more far-flung areas during an emergency. And in addition, while many fire stations are maybe equipped with diesel generators, in Puerto Rico, there are frequent diesel outages as well. So fire stations were either having to travel for miles just to get diesel to power their generators, or we're just having to go without power. And as we saw in Texas, it is very easy for those generators, particularly in a home scenario, to be improperly operated, and that can actually also lead to deaths from inhalation. And this also gets into kind of the importance of clean backup power in households as well as in critical service facilities. We've seen that more and more people are opting for medical care at home, or in lower income communities, they often can't afford access to longer term medical facilities. And for those individuals, blackouts can be a life-threatening situation if they're unable to power their home medical devices. These residents are also often less likely to evacuate during a severe weather event, so they're usually doubly at risk in severe weather outages. And in addition to just outage scenarios for loss of power for things like medical devices, weather itself can be a huge burden for underserved communities. I'm sure many of us are currently in places that are facing record-breaking heat. And in those instances, many families either don't have access to air conditioning or can't afford to run an air conditioner long enough to protect them during the worst heat during the day. And in those instances, having community resilience hubs, as Elena mentioned, or access to cooling centers can make a huge difference. And a big part of CUG's work is working with community organizations that are looking to be a sort of resilience hub for their community and be able to provide those cooling or heating services during severe weather. And then finally, I did also want to touch on the undue public health burden facing many underserved communities that energy storage can play a role in alleviating. This has been touched on previously, but there are over 1,000 fossil fuel plants currently located in environmental justice communities across the US. And many of those plants are hyper-polluting peaker plants. And these plants produce really high amounts of NOx and other particulates, which can lead to outsized instances of asthma and other respiratory illnesses. And those often compound other airborne illnesses such as COVID-19. We've seen higher rates of mortality in those communities, and it just accelerates a burden of injustice that we really need to do a lot to fix. Next slide, please. So in terms of addressing all these issues, I think all of my panelists have cited some really good recommendations, and I want to provide some general recommendations as well that can be applicable regardless of sort of the implementing institution. One thing I did want to flag is that while large-scale battery storage projects can be a great solution for reducing energy burden, and certainly in the case of replacing fossil fuel plants, they have a huge impact. But those large-scale projects, I personally think, need to be paired with smaller scale projects to really get the equity and resiliency benefits. They're going to have an immediate impact on marginalized communities. In terms of energy burden, creating incentives for both small and large scale projects, as well as more revenue generating opportunities like demand response programs, can really go a long way to helping reduce energy burden and also create opportunities for wealth creation. Programs like the California Self-Generation Incentive Program are good examples of policies that can benefit both marginalized and mainstream communities and expand the battery storage market overall. From a healthcare and emergency preparedness standpoint, I think one thing that is really evident is that we need to start thinking about these events holistically. For underserved communities, severe weather has an impact on all levels. Facilitating coordination between either on the federal level, DOE, DHS, and FEMA, on the state level, energy agencies, healthcare, and disaster response, to pool those existing resources can ensure that our most vulnerable communities are equipped with clean backup power during a crisis. And this backup power can provide resilience even during normal conditions, particularly in areas, again, like Puerto Rico, where the grid can be unreliable. I can think of one example of a fire station that was equipped with solar and battery storage by one of our partners that was actually able to act as a voting center during an outage because so that a local election could continue because they were equipped with backup power and solar. And that, you know, is an example of how battery storage can facilitate a better quality of life even during a blue sky conditions. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, replacing existing peaker plants with renewables and battery storage is a hugely impactful way to improve the burden on environmental justice communities. I think overall, as we're discussing equity and energy storage, we do need to be aware that the current sort of centralized power system has perpetuated inequality for decades. And so to really ensure that we are creating a just and equitable future, we do need to be doing more than just replacing the generating aspects of that system. We need to reshape the entire system to ensure that those who have not had a voice in it for decades are able to be heard and their needs are able to be met. So yeah, that's all I had, and I look forward to the question and answer portion of our little session. Thanks all.
Thank you, Abby. If all of us can come back on video, I think you guys all touched on the questions that I was gonna ask. So I think the next session is going to be you having more time to discuss and give us more examples and, you know, have discussion amongst within yourselves. So before getting into specifics, I think I want to start a little bit broad and engage your perspectives, you know, on the energy justice, energy equity targets. You know, we heard yesterday from the Secretary of the Justice 40 Initiative, right? And there are other government and, you know, organization-specific energy equity targets, right? But we also have the other side of, you know, the social equity, you know, social justice goals that are kind of broader, right? So if you can speak briefly on how you define energy equity or what it means to you and your work, just, you know, maybe 1 minute each, I would really appreciate that. I'm going to start with Julia again and follow the same order on this one.
Well, I also just want to say thank you again to all the panelists and to you, Bethel. That was a great conversation. Abby, I want to reiterate how we're reshaping the conversation. I think this is a great opportunity to build in the points that the recommendations that Jeremy had and Elena, the hybrid solutions that are needed for both local and system-wide to address the costs. In the different hats that I wear working with Jeremy and the Just and Equitable Transition Coalition and other groups, like I feel like we're still evolving into the energy equity definition. And I think it was really fascinating from the previous conversations about each industry and kind of each developer and each organization kind of has its own. And I think as soon as we can start meshing these together for everyone to kind of get on a common terminology, it will be really helpful to start implementing it. And so I look forward to all of us strengthening in the understanding and acceptance of what energy equity is, because I still feel like from the developer industry side is that there's still a learning curve that needs to happen. And I look forward to working with all of you to help implement the appropriate definitions, the right understanding, transparency, and kind of interpretations of what energy equity is. So I'm going to hand off to my panelists to help build on that, but know that there is a desire to understand and learn better, and that there's a need to really put it out there that in the consistent manner so that these different organizations, developers, and industry can start implementing it.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something pretty similar, Julia. So thanks a lot for that, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I do think it. We've been talking a lot about peaker plant replacement, which is I think a really. I mean, Elena articulated it really well about the opportunities there to really help communities that are overburdened by pollution and have been for a very long time. I think there are more connections to be made, with when you think about the large coal-fired power plants and when those go offline in very rural areas, the local economy just takes an enormous hit because there's just not a lot of other opportunities in those places. And so connecting the potential for energy storage plus renewables to fill the gap. So making sure that we don't replace coal with natural gas, and so fill the gap in the generation that we need, but also making sure that we make those workers and communities whole. that are gonna be negatively impacted by that transition. So that's the aspect of it that I think about a lot in terms of in my work is in terms of how does it affect energy transition communities. So again, thinking about the particular. So I guess to tie it in a bow, the way that we thought of it at UCS was, let's take a step back and think about what is your goal for deploying energy storage? Which of the set of problems are you trying to solve? And let's focus in on that one, and how do you make that particular piece equitable? So I gave a couple of examples. We've talked a lot about peakers, but another one is resiliency, and others have given really tangible examples about that. So I guess.
Thanks, Jeremy. I know I said all of you, but I'm going to ask another question and pass that question to Abby and Elena. So there's, even now with the definitions, there's a lot of big picture conversation we hear, right, around, the need to be more just in general, especially with the just energy transition, not just here in the US, but globally with the energy transition, we want to have that just transition, right? But there's also those immediate issues, that face governments, utilities, individuals, for example, at the local level. Here in the US, we know, 1 in 3 US households face some sort of energy insecurity due to, service disconnection, for example, or loss of comfort because of, the heat right now, right? And Abby, you also mentioned energy burden, right, in your presentation, and we know that low-income households tend to pay 3 times more of their income compared to affluent households just to afford energy, right? And also there is the issue of, workforce development, right? And making sure that the clean energy transition or the jobs in the clean energy transition are accessible to all, right? We want to make sure that is also done in a fair manner, right? So my question here is, are we missing out on addressing these immediate or urgent needs in the energy transition? That is big picture versus, immediate actions necessary, right? And how can storage, or other grid investments help us address those changes? Because, if you are thinking big picture, obviously you might need incremental change to happen. But if you are the person who's being burdened by these, energy burdens, right, you don't have that time to kind of wait for incremental change to take place, right? So how can storage, help us address those two big picture at the same time in, immediate actions needed? Abby, I'm going to have you start, and then Elena, you can chime in as well.
I'm glad you're letting me go first, because I feel like this was going to be my response to your first question. Actually, is I feel like in order to ensure equity, I think we do need to balance sort of the longer term solutions with immediate impacts to ensure that the folks who need help now are getting it and are seeing the benefits of a clean energy transition. And I think storage can play a huge role in that. I think, again, as I said earlier, balancing the large scale projects with smaller scale projects, for example, putting solar and storage in a community center or creating a resilience hub in a low income community can have a huge impact on a local community and really ensure that they have access to, for example, air conditioning on a hot day. Those are immediate problems that they're facing right now. And I think being able to both showcase those examples so folks aren't just thinking of this as an abstract concept that is going to kind of pass them by, and also ensure that their needs are able to be met while we're facilitating that longer term transition is really important.
Elena, do you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. I think to add into that, we sort of see this in our sort of research across the board, is we're constantly trying to figure out the best way to add storage to the grid, the best way to add pollution, reduce pollution from the grid. But at the same time, many of these affected communities know they're polluted. They know that they have high energy cost burdens. They don't need more research necessarily to show that that is true. And there are constant ways that we can improve these policies. And I think it's important to sort of lay out the 5-term goal, that 10-year goal, in terms of how to increase equity, to improve our processes, to improve community engagement, but that those goals should in no way mean that we don't do anything for 5 years or 10 years, and that we have to start that implementation now, or honestly yesterday.
I agree. And I'm going to jump to the other point that everybody has been asking about the peaker plant replacements. And Elena, you presented on that as well. And I came across your work because of the peaker plant work that you have been doing at PSH. So I think my question there is, when I think of energy equity, I think of two critical dimensions. One is making sure there is, equitable access to clean energy for, everyone. And then also we are repairing past inequities or mitigating, disproportionate, negative effects of pollutants, emissions, climate change on disadvantaged communities, right? Abby, actually, you mentioned that in 2020, the US had 1,000 peaker plants in disadvantaged communities, right? So we know who's facing the worst of these impacts, right? So my question there is, what is the role of storage in contributing to these two goals, right? In allowing us to have equitable access to clean energy, and at the same time being able to mitigate these disproportionate negative effects of climate change, for example. And you've already talked about this, but the 2 points I wanted to kind of get from you is, what is it that about energy storage that makes it, the resource that we want, or the equitable, the equity asset, as the title of this session is, right? And then what are the limitations? Every resource has some sort of limitations, and what should we be aware of in terms of the limitations? And I'm gonna have Elena start again, and then I'll go to Julia and Jeremy.
I mean, I think one of the benefits of energy storage is that it can play so many different kinds of roles on the grid, right? We know that it can be a transmission asset, a distribution asset, it can replace a generator, it can serve as a supply, it can do, in some ways, all of the things. It can be utility scale, it can be distributed. I think that necessarily is one of its limitations too. How do you integrate, hundreds of thousands of different storage assets everywhere in order to optimize and meet all of these different goals in different places? We are specifically actually trying to do this right now in a sort of follow-up on our peaker work, is we're looking at a specific plant in the Los Angeles area and how we can replace that with what we're thinking of as an equity and health focused virtual power plant. So a set of distributed storage and solar and other resources that both mitigates historic inequities. We're targeting one of the more polluting plants in a heavily overburdened neighborhood, to try to replace, and doing so with a set of storage and other clean energy assets that also bring benefits. So how do we stack together storage and efficiency and other resources for low-income households at resilient climate centers to displace diesel generators? There's 12,000 in the LA area. So can we stack together all of those things to displace that historic pollution, those cumulative environmental burdens, while increasing energy access at the same time? What we often see for peaker power plants in particular is many of these are actually located in transmission constrained neighborhoods in different places in New York, in Los Angeles. And so if you have a power plant in the middle of somewhere and you put a bunch of solar panels or storage nearby, that doesn't necessarily displace emissions from that power plant, but investing in these transmission constrained areas where that peaker plant is meeting that local demand actually means that investments in that historically underserved community have more of a direct chance of displacing those emissions in those communities while providing some of those benefits in the same process.
Thanks, Elena. Julia, you want to add something?
It was fantastic, Elena. I think so also for highlighting the different value add of long duration energy storage, which as we're doing our education outreach, working with various stakeholders, regulators, legislators, there's no credit given to a lot of these assets that long duration and short duration energy storage provide. And so we've been trying to build up the policies so that our credit is given so that you can, have the market access and really have the incentives out there to really put the long duration energy storage in the right areas. And not all of it is going to be in California. There are some communities who said, I've had this plant by me. We don't want this anymore. We want something completely different. We want a park, build it somewhere else. And so what does that look like? Because our grid is interconnected. There are pumped hydro storage projects that are outside of California that can add clean energy onto the grid and be that backup storage to help California, to help other regions. I mean, its social equity piece is so important to really kind of define all the different attributes that the various projects can provide. And so it's, again, what's in my backyard? What do I want to replace in my backyard? If I don't want this, what are the other attributes? And how is it going to keep my emissions low and my costs low? And I think that's part of the key criteria in these new procurements and these new requests that come out is, how are you helping social equity? What is your project, storage, transmission, doing to help, improve and address our climate goals? And I think that's really important to have it as, we go forward, is, giving the value add to these different technologies that are going to make a difference, but also looking at the broader space of access and transparency.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask my closing question, and I'm going to start with Jeremy on that one. So in looking ahead, I guess, what are the strongest opportunities that we have, to make a difference in energy equity? And are those opportunities with regulators? And we have heard earlier from utilities. So do utilities have the strongest opportunity? Is it, the federal policy that we need, or is it industry, et cetera? So where do you see the opportunities are, and what would be your advice? And I'll ask Jeremy to start, and then based on time, the rest of you can chime in as well.
Sure. And once again, thanks for inviting me to speak. I guess I would say that the thing that I'm the most excited about is the stuff that Elena was talking about in terms of how do you drive peaker plant replacement. There's just a lot of, it seems like sort of win-win kind of things. And you didn't mention, I don't think, Elena, the economics, but the economics are also favoring, installing storage and getting rid of all these natural gas peakers. I mean, it's something like most of them will be uneconomic relative to storage in less than a decade. So there's a lot of reasons where they're sort of adding up as a really exciting near-term opportunity. And then I would say I see a lot of states doing things around storage and on broader energy and climate policy. So those are ways, and that's again what our work was focused on, was trying to make policymakers aware of some of these different equity aspects of the legislation that they're trying to pass. And so I'll give you a concrete example, which was thinking about carve outs. If you're going to set a target for storage deployment, thinking about how much of that can go into underserved or disadvantaged communities. So things like that. I think there's a lot of opportunities at the state level. And there's been a wide range of ambition, from really ambitious targets for storage deployment all the way to pilot programs and studies around how it can be deployed equitably.
Thanks, Jeremy. Abby, you want to add something to that?
Sure. Yeah, to echo Jeremy, I think it's great that we're seeing such a huge appetite to be expanding both energy storage and equity aspects across states and also on the federal level. And I think it's a really exciting time for the energy storage market as a whole. One thing I'll add is that I think on the federal level, seeing just greater coordination among agencies to really address the different aspects of what equity means in a just energy transition. It's not just reducing people's energy burdens, it's also ensuring they have access to home health care, and how do those things coordinate? I think pooling those resources and really making sure that we're addressing all aspects of energy burden and what that actually means can go a long way towards improving the outcomes in those communities.
Thanks, Abby. Julia, I think we have 2 minutes, so I'm gonna give Julia and Eleanor 1 minute.
Well, I'll share my time. I just want to echo again Abby's point about the coordination, the connective tissue I mentioned earlier of just highlighting these different areas that need to be connected and kind of really repurposed and recycled and revalued is really important. So the equity component is essential to the discussion, and we haven't done justice in the right work, and we need to start improving upon it now. So I'll let Elena or Jeremy or Abby add any other things, but thanks again.
I guess I just wanted to flag that I think one of the interesting things going forward is going to be to figure out how to integrate efforts on a federal level and on a local level. So one of the things that we really see is that you need community input, you need community, buy-in and figure out what community priorities are in order to effectively add these resources in a way that are going to provide those benefits. How do you do that? While channeling, federal funding and federal targets, and how do you apply that from state to state and locality to locality? And so I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's going to be a really important consideration going forward in the next few years.
Right. And there's such diverse technologies that are out there, both in long duration and short duration. It's just, having the discussions, pushing them forward, the incentives, and really making sure that we can, meet these different goals. But it's very exciting.
Yeah, thank you all for being a part of this session. It was very insightful, and we really thank you for taking the time to be here. And this concludes our session, and I'll pass it on back to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was a terrific talk and a sets of slides, and it really generated a lot of comments in the chat and from our attendees. Thank you. I really appreciate all of those contributions, and everyone, we will make sure all of that is online and available. So now I want to switch over because I'm so pleased to welcome remarks from Congressional Representative Melanie Stansbury. Let me offer a little bit of introduction to her. But she's here to join us and offer closing remarks and help us finish this amazing roundtable. So welcome. Representative Melanie Stansbury is New Mexico's first congressional district representative. She was elected to Congress at the beginning of June 2021. She replaced Deb Haaland and what the New York Times called a landslide. She was born and raised in New Mexico. She has a very impressive resume. Degrees from Cornell and St. Mary's in ecology and sociology. She worked as a science educator and an advisor on environmental issues in New Mexico. She worked in DC for the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, as well as OMB. And then she returned to New Mexico as the first woman elected to represent the 28th district in the New Mexico legislature. She passed 14 pieces of legislation on subjects varying from childhood hunger to modernizing the electric grid before turning her attention to the pandemic. And now she has a very busy schedule as a brand new member of Congress. So we are so thrilled to welcome her and to give her the floor to offer her remarks to close out our roundtable here. So Representative Stansbury, over to you.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and hello, everyone. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here with you today. As was said in that wonderful introduction, I'm Melanie Stansbury, and I represent New Mexico's first congressional district, which is the center of Albuquerque and also home to Sandia National Laboratory. And I want to thank Sandia Labs, the PNNL Labs, of course, Department of Energy, Rebecca, and my dear friend, Angela Becker-Dipman, who I know many of you know, who is also my former boss on the Senate Energy Committee. It's really an honor to be here. And I actually learned the art and the craft of public policy making working for Angela on the Senate Energy Committee. And that is where I really got my first taste of and cut my teeth working on energy transition work. Though I had previously worked in the Office of Management and Budget on a lot of climate issues. But I'm excited to talk to you today. As was said in the introduction, I've been working on climate and energy issues for a number of years. I started working on these issues first at OMB during the Obama administration. I was one of the federal climate science budget coordinators over at OMB. And then I was lucky enough to come over to the committee for a couple of years while we were working on a very large energy package, which did not passed during the Congress that I was serving as a staffer, but then pieces of which were subsequently passed and which many of you are working to implement now. But upon returning home to New Mexico, I found myself elected to the state legislature in the crucible of the energy transition. And I like to say that this is an issue that's very personal and near and dear to me because my parents were energy workers. So I was born in Farmington, New Mexico, which is the oil patch in northwestern New Mexico. And it's also home to the San Juan Generating Station, which is currently undergoing closure as part of the Energy Transition Act, which New Mexico passed in 2019. And my own mother was one of the very first crane mechanics at that power plant and helped to build that power plant in the late 70s, early 80s. And my dad worked in the oil fields. And because I think, that is part of my family history, these issues have always been very close to me, not just because I believe strongly that we have to take immediate action to address our climate crisis, but we have to do so in a way that is just and equitable and addresses the economic needs of our communities, because these energy jobs affect our frontline communities. They're good union paying jobs. And so how do we think about equity and justice as we're going through this energy transition? So in New Mexico, we have been at the forefront of this energy transition over the last several years. In 2019, our legislature passed the Energy Transition Act, which put New Mexico on a path to zero carbon electricity generation by 2045. And it was enacted by our legislature, it was passed by our governor, and some of the significant provisions in that bill included grants and funding for our workforce solutions department to work with frontline communities to do economic development planning for transition. Then in 2020, I, working with colleagues in the legislature, passed a grid modernization bill, and we passed that bill unanimously out of the Senate, which was kind of unheard of on an issue that can sometimes be controversial. But I really credit that to the vision of the leaders in our community who understand that if we are going to transition our electric grid to renewables, if we're going to make critical infrastructure investments, if we're really going to deploy the technology revolution to make it possible to have smart grids, and we're going to address the energy sovereignty, self-determination, and justice of our communities, we have to completely overhaul our grid to do so. So we worked with an amazing coalition of people, including our utilities, industry, state, tribal, and local governments. We worked with the oil and gas industry. We worked with everybody. Everybody was invited to come to the table. And I really credit our success to that model of bringing everyone to the table, saying every idea is good and we need to consider it as we're trying to figure out how we navigate this difficult transition. But I think that the need to do this kind of expansive work has been especially highlighted over the last year, as we've seen obviously the failure of the Texas grid for the many complex reasons that occurred, as well as the impacts of the pandemic on especially rural users' access to electricity and many of the issues that we've seen about energy justice and access. So I believe, and it sounds like you all have been talking about this over the last several days, that we are really on the precipice not only of a clean energy revolution in this country, in this world that is necessitated by the need to address our climate crisis, but on the precipice of a new way of thinking about what energy justice and transition looks like. And we talk about it, but I think we're starting to really see its manifestation in the ways in which communities are being centered in this conversation. So in New Mexico this last session, in our legislative session, I was fortunate enough to work with an incredible coalition of social justice groups, environmental organizations, industry partners, to really say, how do we put our communities' voices, ideas, and dreams at the center of what energy transition and social justice means? And that is a completely new conversation, because we know we have to modernize our grid. We know we have to make a clean energy transition. We know we have the engineering capabilities to do that. We know that if we have investments from the federal and state and local governments and utilities, that we can deploy those technologies and infrastructure investments. But the real question is, how do we address the climate crisis and build a more socially and environmentally just future for our communities? And that is at the center of work that you all are going to do over the next several decades of your work, because our national labs, our universities, our nonprofit think tanks and organizations have the know-how to bring tools, science, technology to bear on these questions. Now, do we have the heart and political will to put our communities at the center of it? And that's what energy justice and equity is really about. So I'll leave you all with that pondering. I am here in Congress. My door is always open. I look forward to working with all of you to provide resources and opportunities to do this work and lift up your work. And I just thank you all for having this conference and inviting me to come and share with you in it today. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. In a way, I think you not only wrapped up what we did here, but also laid down the big challenges ahead of us. So thank you for putting so much heart and thought, and thank you for being in Congress to represent these important issues. I think with that, to me, that's a wonderful way to just end this roundtable. Imre, did you have any final comments you wanted to make?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, Melanie, and the previous panel and the panel before that and yesterday's panels. I think they were all terrific. And the roundtable has pretty much met our expectations and our hopes. So we come now to the end of the roundtable and the beginning of the future. What are we going to do with this? Well, the initiative which we are starting is not only a research initiative, it is intended to actually start projects, kick off projects, and address the immediate problems in equity communities. And so among the things that we have in mind is, first of all, an immediate initiative with fiscal year 21 funds on equity and resiliency projects, with a certain amount of research thrown in for metrics and such things, but with real projects. Next year, we are hoping for a FOA, where we solicit equity projects and provide funding, but not just funding for the project, but technical assistance and guidance to the communities who will participate in that. The other thing that we have in mind is to have more roundtables, more workshops. And for example, I'm thinking of doing a workshop on metrics specifically, where we bring all the people together who have metrics or are planning metrics and try to work out the most useful metrics that we can use to find the communities, to define their needs, and then to estimate the benefits of the projects that we are going to enact. Another workshop that I have in mind addresses the question of who will pay for this. And that will be a workshop involving the financial community, who is beginning to have a great interest in energy storage, and who will be interacting with us and hopefully helping us in the future. So with that, we will close, and thank you all, and do good.
Thank you all. We'll end the roundtable now. Goodbye.